At 6:47 in the morning, a Navy SEAL team moved through the emergency entrance of Harlow Ridge Medical Center like they owned every square inch of the building. 8 operators in full tactical gear, rifles lowered but hands ready, scanning every face they passed. The charge nurse dropped her clipboard. An orderly backed against the wall. And at the far end of the corridor, on her knees beside a biohazard cart, scrubbing dried blood from a grout line nobody else would touch, a woman in plain scrubs looked up. The team leader stopped. He stared. Then, in front of everyone, he saluted her. "Major Hayes," he said, "we've been looking for you." Before the story goes any further, if you've never been here before, hit that subscribe button right now because this channel is where the stories nobody tells out loud finally get told. Tap the like button if you're already hooked and drop a comment below with your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The mop bucket had a broken wheel. It dragged sideways every time Delia Hayes pulled it, leaving a faint wet streak across the linoleum that she would have to come back and dry before shift change or risk a slip and fall report with her name on it. She already had 2 written warnings this month. A third would go straight to administration, and administration at Harlow Ridge Medical Center had made it quietly, professionally clear that they were looking for any documented reason to restructure the overnight nursing roster. Restructure. The word they used when they meant fire. Delia pushed the bucket around the corner near radiology and squeezed out the mop head. The hallway smelled like industrial bleach and old coffee. It was 5:55 in the morning, and most of the day staff wouldn't arrive for another hour, which meant she had 60 minutes to finish the biohazard cleanup in Bay 4, restock the supply cart outside the trauma wing, and change into a fresh set of scrubs before her actual nursing shift began at 7. She had been working both assignments, custodial overflow and nursing duties, for 11 days straight because Karen Dolby, the nursing supervisor, said they were short-staffed and Delia was adaptable. What Karen meant was that Delia hadn't complained yet, and until she did, this arrangement would continue. Delia hadn't complained, not because she didn't have things to say. She had more to say than any of them would want to hear. But she had learned a long time ago, in places much harder than a hospital hallway, that the moment you open your mouth to defend yourself, you give the people who already disrespect you something new to use against you. So she stayed quiet. She pulled the mop. She stocked the carts. She showed up on time, every time, and she did her job better than anyone in that building understood. She had been at Harlow Ridge for 31 days. 31 days since she drove into Callaway, North Carolina, with 2 duffel bags and a lease agreement for a 1-bedroom apartment 6 blocks from the hospital. She had chosen Callaway specifically because it wasn't anywhere she had ever been before. No history, no colleagues who knew her, no one who would look at her name and start asking questions she didn't want to answer. She had wanted a fresh start, and Harlow Ridge had offered her a position. Registered nurse, trauma intake, full-time, no supervisory responsibilities. She had accepted it without negotiating the salary, which was the first clue in hindsight that she was walking into a place that mistook humility for weakness. The second clue came on her 3rd day, when Dr. Garrett Finch, one of the senior emergency medicine physicians, reviewed her intake paperwork and told her, with the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile at all, that her nursing school transcripts were adequate, and her prior service record was interesting, but not especially relevant to how things were done here. "We have a system," Dr. Finch had told her. "Nurses support physicians. Physicians direct clinical decisions. If there's ever any ambiguity about where those lines fall, I want you to come to me first. Not to another nurse. Not to Karen. To me." Delia had nodded and said, "Understood." She understood perfectly. She understood that he was telling her, in the language that men like him had been using her entire career, that she was to make herself small and stay there. It wasn't the worst thing anyone had ever said to her. Not even close. She finished mopping Bay 4 at 6:22, changed into clean scrubs in the staff locker room, and was heading back to the nursing station when she heard the shouting from the pediatric intake corridor. Not panic shouting, not the sharp, urgent call of a medical emergency. She knew what that sounded like, and it had a different quality, a different pitch. This was something nastier. The voice of someone who was used to getting what they wanted, currently not getting it, and letting everyone within earshot know about it. "I've been waiting 40 minutes. 40 minutes. My son has a fever of 103 and every single person in this waiting room has been taken back before us. and I want to know why." Delia turned toward the sound without thinking about it. She came around the corner to find a man in his early 40s, broad-shouldered and red-faced, standing in front of the triage desk where a young nurse named Priya was trying to explain the triage system in a voice that was doing its best not to shake. Beside the man, sitting in a plastic chair with her small legs dangling, was a girl of maybe 5, wrapped in a jacket that was too big for her. The child wasn't crying. She was watching her father with the careful, practiced stillness of a kid who had learned that when adults get loud, the safest thing to do was disappear into yourself. The fever, the father's volume, the 40-minute wait. None of that was the problem. Delia saw the problem in the first 3 seconds. The child's lips had a faint bluish tinge around the edges. Her chest was working too hard. Not dramatically, not the kind of labored breathing that would have set off immediate alarms. But there was an extra effort there, a slight retraction below the ribcage that nobody had caught because the father was loud and the father was the story in the room. The child was not the story. The child was the emergency. Delia walked straight to Priya and said quietly, "Get Dr. Finch or whoever's on. That child needs to be in a bay right now. Possible respiratory compromise." Priya blinked at her. "She's listed as a fever presentation." "I see what she's listed as." Delia kept her voice level. "I'm telling you what I'm looking at. Get a physician. I'll take the father." She didn't wait for Priya to agree. She turned to the man who had pivoted toward her with the energy of someone who had found a new target. "You're a nurse?" he said, in the tone that meant he had already decided the answer didn't impress him. "Yes. I'm going to take your daughter back right now. I need you to come with me, and I need you to answer some questions on the way. When did her breathing change?" That stopped him. "Her... what? Is she asthmatic? Any history of respiratory issues? Has she complained about chest tightness?" The man's anger shifted into something else, something that looked like the first tremor of real fear. She said it was hard to breathe earlier, but she does that sometimes when she's sick, and I thought it was just, okay." Delia was already moving, already guiding the child up from the chair with a hand on her back. "What's her name?" "Lily." "Lily." Delia crouched to the girl's eye level as they walked. "Hi, Lily. I'm Delia. Can you take a big breath for me?" She watched the chest movement, heard the slight wheeze on the exhale, made the calculation in the part of her brain that had been doing this math for 15 years. "You're doing great. We're going to go to a room where it's quieter and we can help you breathe easier, okay?" Lily nodded. Her lips were still wrong. Delia pushed open the door to Bay 2, settled Lily on the exam table, and reached for the pulse oximeter before any of the monitors were even online. The reading came back at 91%. Too low. Consistent with what she'd seen but not seen, the gap between what triage had documented and what the child's body was actually doing. She was attaching a pediatric nebulizer mask when Dr. Finch walked in, looked at the scene and said, "I was told this was a fever case." "Bronchospasm, probable viral trigger," Delia said. "SAT was 91 on room air. I've got albuterol running. She needs a chest film and pediatric consult." Finch looked at the monitor, looked at Lily, who was already breathing slightly easier with the medication running, looked at Delia. "How long did you have her before you started treatment?" 2 minutes. He picked up the chart, said nothing for a moment, then, "I'll order the imaging." He left without acknowledging that she had caught something that should have been caught at triage, or that the child's condition had been quietly deteriorating in a waiting room full of adults too distracted by the father's volume to look at the daughter's chest. Priya came in 20 minutes later while Lily's color was returning and her father was sitting beside her with his elbows on his knees and his anger completely deflated, and whispered to Delia, "You were right. I should have looked closer." "Now you know what to look for," Delia said. Not harshly, just a fact. "How did you know?" Delia adjusted the flow rate on the nebulizer. "Experience." Priya waited, clearly expecting more. Delia didn't offer any. The shift moved on. Lily was admitted to pediatrics. Her father, before he followed the transport team upstairs, found Delia at the nursing station and said, without any of his earlier bravado, "Thank you." Just those 2 words. Nothing elaborate. Delia said, "Take care of her." By 9:30, she had handled 2 additional triage assessments, assisted with a laceration repair on a man who had dropped a sheet of corrugated metal on his forearm, and fielded a question from a second-year resident named Dr. Marcus Webb, who was trying to find a vein in a patient with difficult IV access. She hadn't been asked. She had simply noticed that he was on his third attempt. The patient's arm was starting to bruise badly, and the correct landmark for the vein he was looking for was being obscured by his angle of approach. She said gently, "If you rotate your wrist about 15 degrees and come in from the lateral side, you'll pick it up." Webb looked at her with the particular expression of someone who resented being corrected but couldn't argue with a working IV line. He adjusted, found the vein, said, "Thanks," in the flat way that meant he wasn't. She was charting at the nursing station at 11 when Karen Dolby appeared beside her and set a printed sheet of paper on the keyboard. Karen was in her early 50s, with the kind of administrative posture that had been built over years of sitting at the top of a small, institutional hierarchy. She wore her authority the way some people wore uncomfortable shoes, visibly, and with the apparent belief that everyone else could see how much it cost her. She had been nursing supervisor at Harlow Ridge for 9 years, and in 9 years the ER had developed a particular culture. The nurses who stayed were the nurses who didn't make trouble, and the nurses who didn't make trouble were the nurses who knew their place. "There's been a complaint," Karen said. Delia looked at the paper. It was a patient grievance form. "About what?" "About you initiating treatment on a pediatric patient without documented physician authorization." Delia set down her pen. "The child had oxygen saturation of 91% on room air. I applied supplemental oxygen and started a nebulizer treatment that was within the standing orders protocol for respiratory distress in pediatric patients." "That's your characterization. That's what the standing orders say." Karen picked the paper back up and smoothed a crease in it that didn't need smoothing. "Dr. Finch feels that you exceeded your scope." Delia looked at her steadily. "Dr. Finch ordered imaging and a consult after I had the patient stabilized. The child's saturation was back to 97% by the time pediatrics took over. I'd like to know exactly which part of that was outside my scope." "Delia." Karen's voice shifted into something that was meant to sound reasonable. "I understand you have a strong background. I understand you're used to a different pace of work. But this is a cohesive team, and team cohesion requires everyone to operate within their defined role. When nurses start making independent clinical decisions, it creates confusion. A child was in respiratory distress, and there were physicians available. There were physicians available in Bay 1 dealing with a cardiac arrhythmia and in the break room." Delia let that sit for a beat. "I made a judgment call. It was the right one." Karen's expression tightened at the edges. "I'm going to need you to sign the incident report. It's standard procedure." Delia looked at the form, looked at Karen. "I'll sign it." She signed it. She kept her face neutral and her handwriting precise, and she did not allow herself to say any of the things that were perfectly organized in the back of her mind, because saying them would accomplish nothing except confirming the narrative Karen Dolby had already built. That Delia Hayes was difficult, that Delia Hayes didn't understand the culture here, that Delia Hayes was going to be a problem. She understood the culture. She had understood it since week 1. She had survived much worse cultures than this one. The afternoon brought a shift in the weather and a corresponding uptick in the ER. 2 fender benders from the first rain of the season, a construction worker with a suspected ankle fracture, an elderly man whose family had finally convinced him to come in about the shortness of breath he'd been dismissing for a month. Standard emergency volume, controlled chaos. Delia moved through it the way she moved through everything, efficiently, without performance, doing what needed to be done and staying out of the way of anything that didn't require her. At 3:17 in the afternoon, the radio crackled. Not the hospital intercom, the actual emergency band radio that sat on a charging dock near the ambulance bay entrance, the one that crackled with county EMS traffic and only ever got the full attention of the ER staff when the frequency and the tone meant something bad was happening somewhere. The dispatcher's voice was controlled and very precise, which was how you knew it was serious. "Harlow Ridge, be advised. Incoming trauma, multiple casualties, highway incident at mile marker 44, collision involving civilian vehicle and military transport. Responding units have 3 critical, 2 serious, 4 walking wounded. First unit ETA 7 minutes. The charge nurse, not Priya, the afternoon shift nurse, a veteran named Joelle, hit the trauma activation protocol, and the ER shifted gears with the particular institutional efficiency of a department that handled major incidents regularly. Bays were cleared. Crash carts were positioned. The surgery resident on call was paged. Delia was assigned to Bay 3 and told to prep for a serious trauma. She prepped. She didn't ask questions. She checked her equipment twice, the way she always checked her equipment, and then she stood and she waited, which was the part most people never talked about, the waiting, after you'd done everything you could do to be ready, before the doors opened and you found out what was coming through them. The first ambulance backed into the bay at 3:24. The second came 90 seconds later. The third arrived while Delia was still absorbing the volume of what was being unloaded from the first two. Civilian passengers from the collision, most of them stable or stabilizing, the kind of injuries that were bad but survivable. A broken arm, a lacerated scalp, a woman with possible spinal involvement being moved with agonizing care. But it was the fourth transport that changed everything in the room. Not an ambulance, a military vehicle, a dark green medical transport with government plates that pulled up without sirens, and with a controlled urgency that was different from the civilian units. The back doors opened, and two figures in military uniforms climbed out, and then they were lifting a stretcher, and on the stretcher was a man in tactical gear with a chest wound that had been field-packed with gauze that was saturated red at the center. The man was alive. His eyes were open. His chest was moving. But the movement was wrong, asymmetrical, the left side lagging behind the right, and Delia saw that before the stretcher had fully cleared the back of the vehicle. She was already moving when Dr. Finch met the transport at the bay door and said, "Get him to Bay 1, tension pneumo, bilateral. Left side only," Delia said. Finch turned. Excuse me? Left side asymmetry. Right lung is compensating. If you decompress bilaterally, you'll collapse the compensating lung and lose him." The two military figures carrying the stretcher had stopped. The man on the stretcher was looking at Delia with the particular focused expression of someone who was fighting to stay conscious and paying very close attention to the conversation happening above him. Finch stared at her. "Nurse Hayes, left side only," she said again. "Please." Something in the room shifted. She wasn't sure what tipped it, whether it was the flatness in her voice or the fact that she hadn't phrased it as a question, or whether one of the military figures had made a sound she didn't register. But Finch looked at the patient's chest, and then back at her, and then he said, "Bay 1, let's move." They moved. Inside Bay 1, with the crash team assembled and the monitors coming online and the controlled noise of a trauma bay in full activation filling the space, Delia positioned herself at the left lateral margin of the patient and found the landmark she needed by feel through the tactical vest that had been cut partially away in the field. The patient grabbed her wrist. Not hard, not aggressive, just a hand that had closed around her wrist in the middle of everything, and she looked down at him, and he looked up at her with eyes that were struggling to stay focused. "You know what you're doing," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "Then do it." She did it. The needle decompression was textbook. The sound, a hiss of trapped air releasing, confirmed what she had seen from 20 feet away in the ambulance bay. The patient's chest rose with immediate symmetrical expansion. His oxygen saturation, which had been falling since the monitors came online, leveled and then began to climb. Finch was across the bay dealing with another patient. The surgery resident looked at the monitor, looked at the patient, and said, "Jesus." "Chest tube next," Delia said, "and we need a surgeon, not a resident." She was already reaching for the thoracostomy tray when she became aware of a presence in the bay doorway that was different from the controlled institutional traffic of the trauma activation. She looked up. 8 men in tactical gear were standing in the hallway outside Bay 1, not moving, not rushing, just standing, in a way that took up the hallway without apologizing for it. The man at the front was a few years older than the others, with the kind of face that had logged a lot of hard weather, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. He said her name. Not Nurse Hayes, not her hospital title or her staff designation. He said the name she had not used in 4 years. The name on a set of commendation orders she kept folded in the bottom of a duffel bag in the closet of her apartment 6 blocks away, under 2 changes of civilian clothes and a box of things she had decided she was done with. "Major Hayes," said Commander Owen Baxter, 7th Special Warfare Group, in a voice that carried clearly across the noise of the trauma bay. I need you to tell me he's going to make it." Every person in Bay 1 stopped moving. Delia kept her hands exactly where they were. Steady. Because her hands had always been the steadiest part of her. She looked at the monitor, looked at the patient, looked at the chest expansion she had just restored. "He's going to make it," she said. Baxter let out a breath that had been held for a long time. And then, because the men behind him did it first, he raised his right hand and saluted the woman in the plain hospital scrubs who was standing in a trauma bay in Callaway, North Carolina, holding a chest decompression needle. From down the hall, Karen Dolby watched through the bay window with her grievance form still tucked under her arm and an expression on her face that Delia, if she had been looking, would have recognized immediately. It was the face of someone who had just realized, completely and too late, that they had profoundly misread the room. The salute lasted maybe 4 seconds. To Delia, it felt longer than that, the way certain moments stretched themselves out against their own duration. The kind of seconds that didn't move at the same speed as other seconds, that left a mark on the air in a room long after the moment itself had passed. She became aware of it the way you became aware of a sound you hadn't registered until it stopped. The full weight of 8 men holding that gesture in a trauma bay in the middle of a working shift, with monitors beeping and staff frozen mid-motion and the patient on the table watching through half-focused eyes. She broke it by turning back to the patient. "I need that thoracostomy tray and I need a surgeon with attending privileges in this room in the next 4 minutes, she said to no one specifically, and everyone in the bay at once. "His pressure's holding, but it won't hold long with that much hemothorax still in the cavity." The room came back to life. The surgery resident moved. A scrub tech she didn't know by name reached for the correct tray without being told twice. Commander Baxter and his team pulled back from the doorway without being asked, which told her something about the kind of men they were. They understood the difference between a moment that belonged to them and a moment that belonged to the patient. Dr. Finch reappeared at 3:41, 7 minutes after the initial decompression, by which point Delia had already prepped the insertion site and reviewed the imaging that had come back on the portable. A significant left hemothorax, no mediastinal shift, which confirmed everything she had read from the asymmetrical chest movement in the ambulance bay. Finch looked at the images, looked at the tray, looked at her. He didn't say anything for a moment that Delia felt acutely. Then, "Walk me through it." She walked him through it. Not defensively, not with any of the accumulated frustration of the past 31 days sitting in her voice. Just clinical, precise, the assessment and the rationale in sequence. He listened. He asked one question about the decompression needle placement, and she answered it, and he nodded once. Not quite acknowledgement, not quite agreement, something more complicated than either of those. And then he scrubbed in, and they worked. It went well. The patient's name, she learned from his dog tags when the vest was finally fully removed, was Sergeant First Class Darnell Okafor. He was 34 years old, blood type A positive, allergic to sulfonamides. He had a tattoo on his left forearm that she didn't read closely enough to understand, but that had the look of something personal rather than decorative. He was going to be okay, and she knew that with reasonable certainty by 4:15 when his pressure stabilized and his saturation climbed to 96% and stayed there. Finch closed. Delia stepped back. The room exhaled. "Good call," Finch said without looking at her. His voice was neutral, which from him might have been the closest thing to a compliment she was going to get. She stripped her gloves and said, "Thank you," and left the bay before anyone could redirect the conversation. Commander Baxter was waiting in the corridor outside. Not with his full team, 3 of his men had dispersed toward the waiting area at some point, and the others were positioned further down the hall in the careful, ambient watchfulness of people trained to monitor a space without appearing to monitor it. Baxter himself was standing against the wall with his arms crossed and his expression doing the thing that military faces did when they were working hard to look neutral. He wasn't neutral. She had known Owen Baxter for 6 years across 2 deployments and 1 joint training exercise that had left 3 people with cracked ribs and a 4th with a grudging respect for what Army trauma medics could do under fire. And she could read the lines of his face well enough to know that neutral was not what he was feeling. "You look terrible," she said, because it was true, and because it was easier than starting with anything that mattered. "You look like you work here," he said, which is the part I'm having trouble with. "I do work here." "As a nurse? On the floor?" "Yes." Baxter unfolded his arms and looked at this corridor ceiling briefly, as if requesting patience from the fluorescent lighting. Delia. Owen. You were running trauma triage for a surgical team of 11 people 8 months ago. I know what I was doing 8 months ago. And now you're... He stopped himself. What happened to your sign-on paperwork? It just said RN, trauma intake. No prior service notation. Nothing. I didn't put it in. Why? She looked at him steadily. Because I didn't want it there. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then something in his posture shifted, not quite softening but redistributing, the way a soldier stood when they had decided to stop pushing a line and start working around it. Okafor knows you, he said. He wouldn't say from where, but he recognized you in the bay, grabbed your wrist. I noticed. He said, and I'm quoting here, she knows what she's doing, which from Darnell Okafor, who has never in his professional life said anything nice about a person during a medical emergency, is practically a sonnet. Despite everything, something at the corner of Delia's mouth moved. How did you find me? Personnel cross-reference. Your RN license registration matched your discharge address, and it flagged through a search we were running for a different reason. He paused. We weren't looking for you specifically. We were looking for qualified trauma personnel in a 3-county radius because of the exercise we have running at Pendleton through the weekend. Then your name came up and I thought... He stopped again. Honestly, I didn't know what I thought. You came in person. I came in person. She absorbed that. There was a whole architecture of things inside that statement that she wasn't ready to open, so she filed it and moved on. Okafor needs to stay monitored overnight. The hemothorax is drained, but his pressure has been variable, and I'd feel better with 8 hours of observation before anyone signs off on a transfer. I'll talk to the attending. That would be Dr. Finch. He'll want it in writing from someone with rank. Not a problem. She nodded and started back toward the nursing station. She had charts to finish and 2 patients she hadn't checked on in the last 40 minutes, and Karen Dolby was going to be generating paperwork about the Bay 1 situation before the end of the shift. She was almost certain of it. Delia, Baxter said behind her. She stopped but didn't turn around. We're going to need to talk. Not tonight, but soon. She started walking again. I know, she said. The talk didn't happen that night, or the next morning. What happened instead was Karen Dolby, arriving at the nursing station at 6:50 the following morning with the expression of someone who had spent an unpleasant night preparing their position and a manila folder under her arm that Delia recognized as the administrative equivalent of artillery. My office, Karen said. Delia's shift had technically started 11 minutes ago. She had already checked in on a post-op patient in Bay 6, restocked 2 medication carts, and fielded a question from the overnight nurse about a patient with altered mental status who had been admitted at 3 in the morning. She followed Karen to her office, which was a small room off the main corridor that smelled like printer toner and old upholstery, and she sat down in the chair across from Karen's desk and waited. Karen opened the folder. I've completed my review of yesterday's events. All right. There are 2 concerns. She set the first sheet on the desk. The first is the pediatric case from morning shift. The documentation shows that you initiated nebulizer treatment and oxygen supplementation on a pediatric patient prior to physician assessment and sign-off. The standing orders protocol for pediatric respiratory distress. I'm aware of the protocol. I'm also aware that Dr. Finch believes the situation was managed outside standard procedure. Dr. Finch ordered imaging and a consult after the patient was already stabilized. Karen's mouth tightened. The second concern is more significant. She set a second sheet on the desk. Your involvement in the trauma case yesterday afternoon, specifically your verbal contradiction of the attending physician's treatment plan in front of the patient, the trauma team, and military personnel. Delia looked at the sheet. It was an incident report co-signed by Dr. Finch. She read it without touching it. I identified a clinical error, she said. The patient had left side asymmetry. Bilateral decompression would have... You're a floor nurse, Delia. The phrase landed the way it was meant to. Flat and final, like a door closing. I have a master's in emergency nursing and 14 years of trauma experience, Delia said. Her voice was completely even. I'm also a floor nurse, yes. This is a hospital with a hierarchy and a liability structure, Karen said. When a nurse contradicts a physician's order in front of a patient, it creates legal exposure for this institution. When a physician's order is incorrect, a nurse has an obligation to document her concern and escalate through the appropriate channels. The patient had 4 minutes of viable hemodynamic window. There was no time to escalate through channels. Karen closed the folder. I understand your perspective. I want you to know that I'm taking your experience into account. The language of HR, the language of institutional management that was designed to sound like accommodation while delivering nothing. But I need you to understand that Harlow Ridge operates on a model of collaborative care, and collaborative care requires defined roles. When those roles get blurred, it creates problems. It also saves lives, Delia said. Occasionally. Karen's expression didn't change. I'm placing a formal performance notice in your file. It documents both incidents. It's not a termination. It's a warning. But I need you to acknowledge it with your signature, and I need your commitment that going forward you'll operate within your defined clinical scope. Delia looked at the form Karen slid across the desk. She looked at it for a long time, long enough that the silence in the room became its own kind of statement. Then she picked up the pen and signed her name. Precise. Legible. The same handwriting she used on every medication order and every nursing note, because the quality of your documentation was the only defense you had when people with institutional power decided to build a case against you. Is there anything else? She said. No, Karen said. That's all. Delia stood up. At the door she paused, not because she was going to say anything that would matter, just because sometimes you needed the person across the desk to know that you weren't the one who was diminished by this conversation. She left without another word. The next 4 days had the quality of a controlled experiment. Delia was reassigned away from trauma intake. Karen's language had been careful, a temporary rebalancing of assignments while the incident review was ongoing, but the practical effect was that Delia was now rotating through general medical surgical, handling post-op checks and medication rounds, and the kind of routine nursing work that had nothing to do with the trauma skills she had spent a decade and a half building. It was a demotion in everything but name. The nurses on the med-surg floor were good at their jobs, and they were not unkind to her, but they had also absorbed the institutional weather report, which told them that Delia Hayes was temporarily in the penalty box, and that proximity to her might complicate their own standing. So they were professionally pleasant and personally careful, and Delia did her work and said very little and kept her documentation airtight. On the second day, Dr. Garrett Finch stopped her in the corridor near the pharmacy window. It was the first time he had spoken to her directly since the trauma bay. The Okafor patient, he said. He's being transferred to the military facility at Bragg this afternoon. I know, I checked his chart this morning. Finch seemed to be working towards something. He stood slightly off-center, the way people stood when they had something to say that they hadn't fully decided to say. His overnight pressure stayed stable, he said finally. I saw that too. The chest tube output was within normal range. Yes. He looked at a point past her shoulder. The decompression placement was correct, he said. Textbook. I want you to know I recognize that. Delia waited. That's all, he said, and walked away. She stood in the corridor for a moment after he left and tried to identify what she was feeling. Not vindication. This didn't feel like vindication, which she had experienced before and knew the specific shape of. It felt more like watching a building settle. No drama, no sudden movement, just the slow acknowledgement that something had been undermeasured and the foundation was making its adjustments. She went back to her medication rounds. On the third day, one of the other nurses on the med-surg floor, a woman named Bet Jarvis, who had been at Harlow Ridge for 11 years and had the unflappable quality of someone who had seen every possible version of hospital drama and had stopped being impressed, sat down beside Delia during a break and said, without preamble, "You know they did the same thing to the last trauma nurse who actually knew what she was doing." Delia looked up from her coffee. Who? Melinda Park. Before your time. She caught a missed aortic dissection 2 years ago. Patient presented with back pain and the attending called it a musculoskeletal issue. Sent the orders through, Melinda flagged it because she'd seen the imaging and the clinical picture didn't add up. Patient went straight to CT and into vascular surgery within the hour. Bet picked at the label on her water bottle. Karen wrote her up for exceeding scope. Finch backed Karen. Park left 6 weeks later. What happened to the patient? Delia asked. Made a full recovery. Never knew how close it was. Bet looked at her directly. I'm not telling you this to depress you. I'm telling you because you should know it's a pattern, not a misunderstanding. Karen doesn't object to nurses being competent. She objects to nurses being more competent than the people above them. Delia absorbed this. Why are you telling me? Bet shrugged. Because Park didn't have anyone tell her. And she left. And 6 months later, a different patient came in with a similar presentation, and the attending called it musculoskeletal again, and that time there was nobody like Park in the room. She stood up, crumpled her water bottle. Just thought you should have the full picture. She walked away, and Delia sat with the full picture for a while. On the 4th day, Commander Baxter came back. Not with his team, just him, in civilian clothes. A gray jacket and dark pants, which on him looked faintly like a costume, the way military bearing never quite disappeared under civilian fabric. He found her during a break, in the small courtyard outside the hospital's east entrance, where staff came to stand in actual sunlight for 12 minutes at a stretch. I looked into your situation here, he said, by way of greeting. Delia didn't ask how. And I think you're being managed out. I know. You know. He sat down on the concrete bench she wasn't sitting on, across from the one she was. And you're going to let it happen? I'm documenting everything. I haven't decided what I'm going to do with it. What you should do with it is escalate. To who? The board? The medical staff committee? She looked at him. Those structures are run by the people who built the culture I'm fighting against. You know how long a formal complaint takes to investigate? I've been here 31 days. I don't have the institutional standing to... You might have more standing than you think, Baxter said. Something in his tone shifted. She had known him long enough to recognize when he was moving from conversation to brief. What did you come here for, Owen? He rested his forearms on his knees. There's a federal review opening, joint medical oversight, military and civilian. It's being run through the Inspector General's office with participation from the Army Surgeon General's Division. They're looking at civilian trauma facilities that have a pattern of adverse outcomes tied to systemic issues in clinical decision-making protocols. He paused. Harlow Ridge is on the preliminary list. Delia went still. They need internal witnesses, he said. People with direct clinical experience who can document what the pattern looks like from the inside. The review is in 6 weeks. If you have documentation, I have documentation. Then you should talk to their lead investigator. She looked at the courtyard. A pair of residents were standing by the door, talking about something with their hands, the way medical people always talked with their hands. A bird was doing something in the hedge near the east entrance that involved a great deal of noise for a small animal. If I talk to an investigator, she said, and Karen finds out before the review is formalized, she'll have me out of here in 72 hours. Yes, Baxter said. She probably will. That doesn't bother you as a plan? It bothers me a great deal. It's still the right call. He let that sit. Delia, I know why you came here. I know what you were trying to do. And I'm not here to tell you that the quiet life is wrong or that you owe anyone anything. But the reason you're good at what you do isn't something you can turn off by picking a different zip code and a lower title. It followed you here. It found you in 48 hours. She didn't answer that. Sergeant Okafor would be dead, Baxter said quietly, if you hadn't been in that bay. Someone else would have caught it. No, he said, they wouldn't have. I watched Finch start to call for bilateral decompression. I watched the room accept that call because he's the attending, and nobody in there had the authority or the experience to push back. Nobody except you. The bird in the hedge found whatever it was looking for and went quiet. The investigator's name is Marlowe, Baxter said. She's civilian, IG office. She's been doing this work for 12 years. I can get you a secure contact. He stood up. Think about it. I already am, she said. He left, and Delia sat in the courtyard until her break was over, doing the particular kind of thinking that had no visible external markers, no pacing, no expression, just a very quiet internal accounting of what she had and what she was willing to risk, and what it was going to cost her either way. She went back inside. At 2:40 that afternoon, the ER received a priority alert. Mass casualty activation. A structural collapse at a construction site 11 miles east of Callaway. A 4-story residential framing project. Partial floor collapse. Workers trapped and injured, and the count still coming in. The hospital went to full trauma activation, and Delia, despite being on med-surg rotation, was pulled back to the ER because Karen Dolby was not in the building, and the charge nurse on duty had looked at the incoming patient volume and made a practical decision. The next 3 hours were controlled catastrophe. 12 patients from the site, ranging from lacerations and fractures to a man with a crush injury to his lower extremities that was going to require a vascular surgeon, and a very long night in the OR. Delia worked 3 patients simultaneously at her peak, moving between bays with the specific economy of motion that came from doing this under conditions that made this look like a comfortable afternoon. She didn't think about Baxter. She didn't think about the investigation. She didn't think about the performance notice sitting in her file. She thought about the man in Bay 4, whose compartment syndrome was progressing faster than anyone had flagged. And she thought about the woman in Bay 7, who was describing her pain in a way that didn't match her imaging. And she thought about the 18-year-old in Bay 2, who had stopped responding to questions in a way that worried her more than his documented injuries. She moved. She caught things. She handed off, escalated, documented. At 5:55, when the surge had finally processed through to where the remaining critical patients were stabilized or in surgery, she was at the nursing station charting when Dr. Marcus Webb, the second-year resident she had helped with the difficult IV access, the one who had said thanks in the flat way, appeared at her elbow. "Bay 4 patient," he said. "The fasciotomy. You flagged the compartment syndrome before the vascular team got to him." "Yes." "They said another 45 minutes and they'd have been looking at amputation." She didn't say anything. "I didn't see it," Webb said. "I assessed him twice. I didn't see it." Delia looked at him. He was 27, maybe 28, with the kind of face that was still learning which expressions it wanted to settle into. He wasn't coming to thank her. He was coming to say something harder than that. "Now you know what to look for," she said. It was the same thing she had told Priya about the pediatric case. She said it the same way, not unkindly, just as a fact. Webb nodded once, didn't leave. "How did you know?" he said. "The pain distribution wasn't matching the mechanism. The swelling pattern was wrong for a simple contusion." She paused. "And the way he described it, the pressure component. People describe compartment syndrome a specific way if you know how to listen for it." "They don't teach that," he said. "No, they don't." He looked like he was going to say something else, and then he didn't, and he walked away, and Delia went back to charting. At 6:30, Karen Dolby returned to the hospital. Delia heard about it before she saw her, the particular temperature change that moved through the staff in advance of Karen's presence, the slight recalibration of posture and conversation that happened when the person with the institutional power walked back into the room. Karen had been at a hospital consortium meeting in Raleigh and had missed the full activation, which meant she was arriving to the aftermath. The discharge paperwork, the surgical updates, the documentation of a 3-hour mass casualty response during which her most formally written-up nurse had apparently been central to multiple critical interventions. She found Delia at the charting station at 6:47. "You were pulled from med-surg during the activation," she said. "The charge nurse made the call, short-staffed on trauma response. That's not standard protocol for an active performance review. There were 12 incoming casualties and 4 of them were critical." Delia didn't look up from her chart. "I don't know what the standard protocol recommendation is for that situation, but I suspect it's to use your available personnel." Karen was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone with nothing to say, the quiet of someone recalculating. "I'll need a full incident report from you," she said. "Every patient you touched today. I've already started documentation on all 12. They'll be complete before I clock out." Another silence. Delia finished a notation and moved to the next entry. "There's something else," Karen said. The quality of her voice had changed. Delia looked up. Karen set a piece of paper on the charting desk. Not a performance report. Not an incident form. A printed email with a letterhead that Delia recognized from a source she hadn't expected to see surface this quickly. The Office of the Inspector General, Department of Defense. The email was addressed to the Chief Medical Officer of Harlow Ridge Medical Center. It was a formal notification of a preliminary inquiry into clinical practices and patient safety protocols at the facility. It requested preservation of all documentation relevant to the inquiry and the availability of clinical staff for interview. It was dated this morning. "Do you know anything about this?" Karen said. Delia looked at the email, looked at Karen. I know what it says, she said. Karen's face had gone through several things and landed on something Delia could only describe as the controlled expression of someone who had just realized the building they were standing in was not as structurally sound as they had believed. This inquiry, Karen said, it affects every department, every administrator, every physician. She kept her voice professional, but the edges were showing. If someone on staff provided information to a federal office without going through the appropriate channels. Was there something you needed me to document? Delia said. Her voice was entirely calm. You mentioned a full incident report. Karen picked the email back up. Her jaw was tight. Have it on my desk by 8, she said. All 12 patients. She walked away. Delia turned back to her documentation. Her hands were completely steady. Outside, through the window at the end of the corridor, the light was doing something complicated with the cloud cover. The kind of late afternoon light that couldn't decide whether to be gold or gray, that came out looking like both at once. She had 12 incident reports to write. She had a secure contact number in her phone from Owen Baxter. She had 31 days of meticulous documentation sitting in a password-protected folder on her personal laptop, every assignment and reassignment and incident form, and the timestamps that showed the pattern Betty Jarvis had named without knowing how precisely Delia had already mapped it. And she had Marlowe, from the IG office, whose email had just arrived at the chief medical officer's desk 6 hours ahead of the timeline Baxter had estimated, which meant someone else at Harlow Ridge had already made the call. She didn't know who. It could have been Bet Jarvis. It could have been Priya. It could have been someone she hadn't spoken to in 31 days. Someone who had watched the same pattern from a different angle and decided that this time, when there was someone in the building who might actually be able to corroborate it, they were going to act. She was going to find out. But first, she had 12 reports to complete, and she was going to complete every single one of them exactly the way she completed everything, thoroughly, precisely, and with the kind of documentation that left no room for anyone to interpret the facts as anything other than what they were. She was still writing at 7:55 when the automatic doors at the far end of the corridor opened, and a woman she had never seen before walked into Harlow Ridge Medical Center with a federal ID badge clipped to her jacket, a briefcase, and the particular walk of someone who had not come here to ask questions politely. She stopped at the nursing station, looked directly at Delia, not at the desk, not at the chart, at Delia specifically, as if she had already known exactly where to look, and said, "Are you Hayes?" "Yes," Delia said. The woman's expression did not soften or warm. It was the expression of someone who had been doing difficult work for a long time and had stopped packaging it in social niceties. "My name is Investigator Reyes," she said. "I think we have a lot to talk about." Investigator Reyes did not sit down immediately. She stood at the nursing station for a moment, taking in the corridor, the bay layout, the position of the security cameras, not conspicuously, not in the way of someone performing thoroughness, but with the ambient cataloging of a person who processed spaces the same way she processed everything else, systematically, without announcing it. Then she set her briefcase on the counter, unclipped her badge, and looked at Delia with the focused, assessing quality of someone who had interviewed a great many people and had developed a finely calibrated sense of which ones were going to waste her time. "Is there somewhere we can talk that isn't a hallway?" she said. Delia glanced at the clock, 7:57. She had 3 minutes before her incident reports were due on Karen's desk, and she had finished the last one 90 seconds ago. She saved the file, printed the stack at the nursing station printer, and said, "Conference room B is usually empty at this hour. Follow me." She stopped at Karen's office on the way and slid the incident report stack under the door, because Karen's light was off and the door was locked. And leaving documentation in limbo wasn't something Delia was willing to do, regardless of what else was happening tonight. Conference room B was a narrow room with a table that seated 6, a whiteboard with someone's half-erased medication cost analysis still on it, and a window that looked out over the parking structure. Delia turned on the lights and closed the door and sat down across from Investigator Reyes, who had already opened her briefcase and produced a legal pad, a recording device, and a printed document that she placed face down on the table. "I'm going to record this conversation," Reyes said. "You can decline, but the recording helps me and it protects you. If you decline, I'll take notes only." "Record it," Delia said. Reyes turned on the device, stated the date, time, location, and both their names for the record. Then she looked up. How long have you been at Harlow Ridge? 35 days. Prior to Harlow Ridge? I can give you my full employment history. I have your employment history, Reyes said. I'm asking how you'd characterize your prior experience level relative to your current role here. Delia looked at her. Significantly overqualified. Something shifted in Reyes's expression. Not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement of a shared understanding. Your military service record. You terminated at the rank of major. Correct. You ran trauma operations for a forward surgical team attached to a special operations unit for the last 3 years of your service. Yes. And you applied here as a staff nurse, trauma intake, without disclosing any of that background. My nursing license is current and fully documented. My military background isn't a requirement for disclosure in a civilian nursing application. No, Reyes said. It isn't. I'm not criticizing the decision. I'm establishing context. She turned over the document on the table. It was a chart. Delia could see that much. But the orientation was away from her. How would you describe the clinical culture here? Delia considered the question, not because she didn't know the answer, but because the answer had layers, and she wanted to give Reyes the one that was most accurate, rather than the one that was most satisfying. Hierarchical in ways that compromise patient outcomes, she said finally. There's a documented pattern of qualified nursing staff being discouraged from flagging clinical concerns through informal pressure and formal disciplinary mechanisms. The effect is a culture where the path of least resistance for a nurse is to defer, document nothing, and let decisions stand even when the decisions are wrong. Reyes wrote something on her legal pad. Can you give me specific instances? Delia gave her specific instances. She gave her the pediatric respiratory case and the timeline. She gave her the Okafor trauma and the bilateral decompression call and the documented aftermath. She gave her the construction site activation and the compartment syndrome case and the 45-minute window that had saved the man's leg. She gave her dates and times and patient identifiers and the names of every physician and supervisor involved in each incident, and she gave them in sequence and without editorializing, because editorializing was what people did when they weren't sure the facts were enough, and she was sure. Reyes took notes and occasionally asked a clarifying question. She was a precise listener, the kind who didn't fill silences with acknowledgement sounds, who waited until she was certain you were finished before she wrote anything down. It was a technique Delia recognized from her own training, from the debrief processes after field operations where accuracy mattered more than rapport. After 40 minutes, Reyes set down her pen. I need to tell you something, she said. The inquiry notification that went to your chief medical officer this morning, that came from our office, and it was not triggered by anything you or Commander Baxter reported. Delia went still. The IG office received a formal complaint 6 weeks ago from a former staff member at this facility. The complaint documented a pattern of adverse outcomes tied to what the complainant characterized as systematic suppression of nursing clinical judgment. Reyes paused. The complainant also provided documentation, internal communications, incident reports, personnel records, that was specific enough and credible enough to open a preliminary inquiry. Who was the complainant? Delia said. I can't tell you that. Was it Melinda Park? Reyes looked at her without expression. I can't tell you that. Delia sat back. The whiteboard. The half-erased medication cost analysis. Someone had written a number in the lower right corner, 87,000, and then stopped, as if they had gotten the answer they were looking for, and left the rest behind. You came here tonight because my name came up, Delia said. Your name and the Okafor incident, and the fact that a federal medical transport was involved in a case at this facility where the clinical record shows significant deviation from what actually happened. Reyes pulled another document from her briefcase. The incident report filed by Dr. Finch describes the Okafor treatment as a collaborative decision made jointly by attending staff. Your name is mentioned once, in passing, as assisting with the procedure. Delia looked at the document. She did not reach for it. That's not what the security footage shows, Reyes said. No, Delia said. It isn't. I need your account on the record, formally, completely. Reyes held her gaze. And I need anything else you have, documentation, communications, observations, whatever you've collected. I have 35 days of documentation. I want all of it. Delia was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the window, the parking structure's sodium lights were coming on in the gathering dark, casting everything in the particular orange-yellow of institutional evening. A car pulled in. A car pulled out. Ordinary things happening at the edge of something that was not ordinary at all. "If I give you everything I have," she said, "and Karen Dolby finds out before your inquiry is formalized." "We're past preliminary," Reyes said. "As of this morning, when the notification went out, this is a formal federal inquiry. That means witness retaliation is a federal offense. If anyone at this facility takes action against you in response to your participation, they're not looking at a disciplinary proceeding. They're looking at criminal exposure." Delia absorbed this. "That doesn't mean nobody will try," she said. "No," Reyes said flatly. "It doesn't, but it changes the math for the people who'd be considering it." She gave Reyes everything that night. The password-protected folder, transferred via encrypted file share to the IG office's secure server. Every incident report, every reassignment notice, every email from Karen Dolby with its careful institutional language, and the timestamps that showed the sequence. The pattern that looked like individual management decisions until you laid them end to end and saw the shape they made together. She gave Reyes the names Bet Jarvis had given her, and she gave her Bet Jarvis's name as a potential corroborating witness, and she gave her Dr. Marcus Webb's name as someone who could speak to the clinical specifics of at least 2 of the cases. Reyes left at 10:15. The hospital had quieted to its overnight register, the particular hush of a facility that never fully stopped but slowed, the kind of quiet that had its own sounds, if you knew how to hear them. Delia drove home, showered, and slept for 5 hours. She was back at 7. The next 3 days moved strangely. Harlow Ridge did not look different. The corridors were the same corridors. The patients were the same rotating emergency. The medication carts, and the charting systems, and the break room coffee maker that had been broken for 6 weeks. None of it had changed. But the atmosphere had changed in the way atmospheres changed when people knew something was happening without knowing exactly what it was. There was a particular kind of institutional anxiety that Delia had seen before, in the hours before a command-level review at a forward base, when everyone knew the evaluators were coming and nobody was entirely sure what they were looking for. Karen Dolby moved through it carefully. She had not referenced the IG notification again since the night it arrived, and she had not said anything to Delia directly beyond standard shift assignment and documentation requests. But she was more precise in her communication than usual, more deliberate in her documentation, and she had started CCing the chief medical officer on emails that she previously would have handled independently. The behavior of someone covering their positions. Dr. Finch was harder to read. He had always been hard to read. But he had stopped finding reasons to be in the same corridor as Delia, which was a different pattern from before. On the second day, Bet Jarvis found her in the medication room and said, quietly, "Someone from a federal office called me yesterday. Investigator. She had questions about staffing decisions from 18 months ago." "What did you tell her?" Delia said. "The truth," Bet said. "Same as I always tell people who ask me the right questions." She picked up a medication log and checked a dosage against the chart. "I also told her about 3 other nurses she should talk to. People who left. People who had things happen to them here that didn't make it into any official record." Delia looked at her. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Bet said. "Just make sure it counts for something." On the third day, everything accelerated. It started with a patient. It almost always started with a patient, because the hospital was a clinical environment and whatever was happening in the institutional layer existed alongside and below the actual work of keeping people alive, and sometimes those 2 layers collided. The patient's name was Roy Tanner. He was 61, admitted overnight through the ER with chest pain and shortness of breath, classified as a rule-out ACS, possible acute coronary syndrome, and placed on the medical floor for monitoring. By the morning of the 3rd day after Reyes's visit, Tanner had been monitored for 14 hours. His initial troponin levels had come back at the low end of abnormal, and the attending covering his case, a hospitalist named Dr. Philip Norwood, had reviewed the labs and charted a plan to repeat testing in 6 hours and discharge if the second set was negative. Delia was doing a medication round on the same floor when she passed Tanner's room and looked in through the open door. He was sitting up in bed, watching the television mounted on the wall, and at first glance there was nothing wrong. He was awake. He was oriented. He had eaten about half of his breakfast. Then she saw his hands. He was gripping the bed rail. Not in distress, not the grip of someone in acute pain, but in the particular tight-knuckled way of someone who had been managing something uncomfortable for long enough that the management had become unconscious. And his jaw. There was something in the way he was holding his jaw that she had seen before in people who were quietly, stoically tolerating something they had decided was not worth mentioning. She stepped into the room. "Mr. Tanner, I'm Delia. I'm a nurse on this floor. How are you feeling this morning?" He looked at her and said, "Fine," in the tone of a man who had grown up in a generation that considered saying otherwise a form of weakness. "Any pain?" A pause. One beat too long. "Little pressure. My back's been bothering me." "Your back," she said. "Where exactly?" He touched his upper back between the shoulder blades, the interscapular region. She looked at his monitor readings on the wall panel. Heart rate slightly elevated. Blood pressure trending up from his admission values. Nothing individually alarming, but together, with the jaw, with the hands, with the interscapular pain that he was calling a back problem. She pulled up his chart on the hallway terminal outside his room. 14 hours of monitor data. The troponin trend was there, the initial low abnormal value, and there was a notation from the overnight nurse about intermittent diaphoresis that had been assessed as patient anxiety. It was not patient anxiety. She paged Dr. Norwood. He called back in 4 minutes. "Tanner in 412, she said. "I need you to look at him. His back pain is interscapular, his pressure's tracking up, he's got a low abnormal troponin from admission, and he's diaphoretic intermittently. I think we need a repeat ECG, and I think we need it now, not in 6 hours." A pause on the line. "His chart says rule out ACS, the troponin was borderline. His presentation has changed since admission. The diaphoresis notation is in the overnight record, and it wasn't followed up. The interscapular component wasn't documented at all because he didn't report it until I asked him directly." She kept her voice level. "I want to repeat ECG, and I'd like you to see him before we make any decisions about timing." Another pause. "I'll come up." He came up in 9 minutes. Delia had already arranged for the ECG technician, who arrived at the same time Norwood did, and the tracing came back 11 minutes after that. Norwood looked at it. His face changed. "Get cardiology on the phone," he said. "Now." The ECG showed ST segment changes in the inferior leads, early but unmistakable, the electrical signature of a myocardial infarction that was in progress, that had been in progress quietly and without drama for an indeterminate number of hours, while Roy Tanner sat in a hospital bed gripping his rail and deciding his back pain wasn't worth mentioning. What followed was controlled and fast. Cardiology came. The cath lab was activated. Tanner was moved within 22 minutes of the ECG finding, which was within the window. Barely, but within it. He was in the interventional suite by 9:40. Delia stood at the nursing station afterward and charted everything. The time she entered the room, the time she paged Norwood, the time the ECG was ordered, the time the finding was reported, the time of transfer. The chain was clean and complete. Norwood found her at the station when it was done. "The overnight nurse documented the diaphoresis," he said. "Why wasn't it followed up?" "I don't know," Delia said. "That's a question for the overnight chart audit." He stood there for a moment. I was a different kind of doctor than Finch. Less invested in the hierarchy, more invested in the outcomes, which made him easier to work with, but also meant he was currently standing in front of her with the uncomfortable expression of someone who was doing his own accounting. "You've been on med-surg rotation for less than a week," he said. "Yes." "Why were you on med-surg?" She looked at him. "Ask Karen Dolby." He did not respond to that. He walked away, and Delia had the sense that the question he had just asked himself was going to lead somewhere, though she couldn't predict where with any certainty. At 11:15, she was called to Karen's office. This time, Karen wasn't alone. There was a man sitting in the chair against the wall. 50s, suit, the kind of face that lived professionally at the intersection of authority and caution. He had a tablet in his lap and the posture of someone who had arrived prepared. "This is Martin Cale," Karen said. "He's Harlow Ridge's legal counsel." Delia sat down in the chair across from Karen's desk and looked at Cale, who looked back at her with the carefully neutral expression of someone who was being paid to have no visible reaction to anything. "Ms. Hayes," Cale said, "I want to be transparent about why we're here. The hospital received notification of a federal inquiry, and as part of our standard response protocol, I've been retained to conduct an internal review of relevant clinical and personnel matters. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want to emphasize that this is a voluntary conversation, and you're free to... Have you interviewed Karen Dolby yet? Delia said. Cale paused. Or Dr. Finch, she said. Or are we starting here? We're conducting a thorough review. I want to understand the order of operations, she said. I have a federal investigator who has my full documented account of the events of the past 35 days. I have submitted that documentation through proper federal channels. If this conversation is designed to get ahead of that process, I want to know who authorized it and why it started with a staff nurse rather than the physician who filed an inaccurate incident report describing a trauma intervention he didn't perform. The room was very quiet. Karen's jaw was doing the tight thing it did when she was working hard to maintain a professional expression over a less professional feeling. Cale set down his tablet. Ms. Hayes, the hospital isn't here to... Then we should be fine, Delia said. She looked at Karen. Is there a clinical matter you need me for? I have patience. Karen said nothing for a moment that stretched. Then, you can go. Delia went. She was back on the floor at 11:30, and at noon she received a text from a number she recognized as Baxter's. Reyes is moving faster than expected. Something came up in the document pull. She texted back, What? The response took 6 minutes. Finch altered 2 incident reports. Not just yours. 2 others, going back 8 months. The metadata shows the edits. She stood in the medication room with her phone in her hand and the weight of that information settling into its correct position in the pattern she had been building for 35 days. Not surprised, the pattern had always implied this. But confirmation, which was different. Confirmation had weight. She put her phone in her pocket and went back to work. At 2 o'clock, Roy Tanner was out of the cath lab and in the cardiac ICU, 1 stent placed, stable, expected to make a full recovery. His wife was in the family waiting area when Delia passed through. She didn't stop to speak. It wasn't her place to update family. That was Norwood's responsibility, and he was already there, talking to the woman in the low, careful voice of a physician, delivering good news he knows could have been very different. Delia kept walking. At 3:20, Dr. Finch was called to a meeting with the chief medical officer. She found out from Bet Jarvis, who found out from someone in administration, which was how information moved through a hospital. Not through official channels, but through the lateral network of staff who had been in the same building long enough to know which doors were never quite closed all the way. The CMO requested his original incident reports, Bet said. Both of them, hard copies and digital. Does Finch know why? He knows the IG inquiry exists. He's been in a meeting with Cale since this morning. Bet's expression was measured. Martin Cale works for the hospital, not for Finch. If the hospital's legal exposure requires Finch to be the problem instead of the solution, Cale will make that pivot. It was a clinical observation about institutional dynamics, and it was accurate. At 4:15, Reyes called Delia's personal cell. The document forensics are confirmed, she said without preamble. The incident report Finch filed on the Okafor case was edited 40 minutes after the initial submission. The original version attributed the decompression procedure accurately. She paused. It also wasn't the first time. We found 2 additional altered incident reports that name nursing staff members who are no longer employed at this facility. One of the former employees has agreed to speak with us. The other we're still locating. Delia leaned against the wall of the stairwell where she had taken the call. The stairwell was cold and smelled like concrete and the distant mechanical suggestion of the HVAC system. What happens now? We interview Finch formally. Tomorrow morning, at the Federal Building in Raleigh. Reyes's voice was the same as it had been in the conference room, precise, uninflected, doing the work without the performance. He'll be informed tonight. He'll have his own legal representation. And Karen? We're interviewing her tomorrow afternoon. I want you to know. Your account has been fully corroborated by the security footage, the patient records, the monitor data, and now the document forensics. If anyone at that facility attempts to challenge your competence or your account of events, they're doing it with no evidentiary basis and very significant personal risk. Delia said nothing for a moment. Is there something else? Reyes said. A patient today, Delia said. Tanner, medical floor. Developing MI, that had been documented as anxiety. Reyes was quiet. He's in the cardiac ICU now. He's going to be okay. Delia looked at the stairwell wall. Cinder block, painted over so many times the paint was its own structural layer. I need you to know about him, because the pattern you're documenting, it's not just about the nursing staff who left, or the incident reports that were edited. It's about what happens to patients when the people who would catch things are too afraid to say anything. Reyes said, I know. 2 words, said with a weight that suggested she had been holding this knowledge for a long time. That's why we're here. She hung up. Delia stood in the stairwell for another 30 seconds. Then she pushed the door open and walked back onto the floor. The shift continued. Patients needed things, and she provided them. A fractured wrist, a post-surgical infection that needed a wound culture, and a call to the physician. An elderly woman who needed her pain medication adjusted and who grabbed Delia's hand when she was leaving and said, "You have kind eyes," which was the kind of thing that landed differently on the 38th day of a sustained institutional fight than it would have on any ordinary day. Delia said, "Thank you," and meant it more than the woman could have known. At 6:40, she was finishing her final chart of the shift when Dr. Norwood appeared at the station with an expression that had made several stops between his previous professional neutrality and wherever it was now. Tanner's wife asked me who flagged the change in his condition, he said. I told her it was the nursing staff. That's accurate, Delia said. She wants to send a formal thank you to the hospital. Delia looked at him. I'm going to make sure the notation in his chart is accurate, Norwood said. The intervention was yours. The timeline is yours. That's going in the record. Dr. Norwood, I'm also going to talk to the CMO, he said, tonight, about the med-surg rotation and what I understand to be the circumstances behind it. He didn't wait for her to respond. He turned and walked toward the elevators. She watched him go. At 7:10, 2 things happened almost simultaneously. The first was that Karen Dolby walked past the nursing station without stopping, carrying her bag, wearing her coat, moving with the particular velocity of someone who had somewhere to be or something to avoid, and disappeared through the east corridor door. The second was that Delia's phone buzzed with a text from Baxter. Finch just lawyered up. Different counsel from the hospital. Personal. She read the text twice. Personal counsel meant Finch had concluded that his interests and the hospital's interests were no longer aligned. Personal counsel meant he was building a separate defense, which meant he was expecting the hospital to let him take the weight of what was coming rather than absorb it institutionally. Personal counsel meant he knew exactly what the document forensics had found, and he understood what it meant. She put her phone away and gathered her things. She pulled on her jacket and walked toward the exit, passing the nursing station where Priya was starting her overnight shift, and the break room where someone had finally fixed the coffee maker, and the bay window where, 38 days ago, Karen Dolby had watched 8 soldiers salute a woman with a mop. The east corridor door opened before she reached it. Commander Baxter was on the other side, and he was not alone. Behind him were 2 people she did not recognize. A man in a dark suit with a military bearing that civilian clothes couldn't fully disguise, and a woman in uniform, full-dress greens, the insignia on her collar indicating a rank that had no business being in the lobby of a county hospital in Callaway, North Carolina at 7 in the evening. Delia stopped. Baxter said, I need a few minutes. Who are they? She said. The woman in uniform stepped forward. She had the particular quality of presence that accumulated over decades of institutional leadership. Not physical size, not volume, just the gravity of someone who had made decisions that cost real things for a very long time. Major Hayes, and she said, I'm Brigadier General Lena Marsh, Army Surgeon General's office. She did not extend her hand. She looked at Delia the way people looked at things they had heard described, and were now seeing for the first time, calibrating the description against the reality. I've been briefed on the IG inquiry. I've also reviewed your service record. Delia felt something shift in the floor under her, not physically, but in the way the ground of a situation shifted when its scope changed. All of it? She said. All of it, said Marsh, including the Kandahar debrief. A pause. And the event that preceded your separation. The east corridor was very quiet. I have some questions, Marsh said, and I think you have some answers that are going to change the shape of what happens next. She held Delia's gaze without blinking. But first I need to know, Are you aware that your former commanding officer filed a classified commendation on your behalf 14 months ago that was buried by someone in the review chain before it ever reached confirmation? The overhead light in the east corridor buzzed once, faintly, and went back to its ordinary, steady hum. Delia stared at the brigadier general. "No," she said. "I was not aware of that." Marsh nodded, as if this confirmed something she had suspected. "Then we have more to discuss than I thought. They used a conference room on the administrative floor, not the narrow room B where Reyes had sat across from Delia 4 days ago, but the larger one at the end of the hall, the one with the oval table and the wall-mounted screen and the chairs that cost more than the equipment in 2 of the bays downstairs." Baxter held the door. The man in the dark suit, who had still not introduced himself, and whose silence had the practiced quality of someone whose job was to observe rather than participate, took a position near the window and stayed there. Brigadier General Marsh sat down at the head of the table. She did not arrange things around herself or make preparatory gestures. She simply sat, and the room organized itself around that fact. Delia sat across from her. Baxter took the chair to Delia's left. "I'll be direct," Marsh said. "I don't have time for anything else, and from what I've read about you, you don't prefer it anyway." "Go ahead," Delia said. "Your separation from service was coded as voluntary. Stress-related. Your own request." Marsh's voice was even. "That's what's in your official record." "I know what's in my record." "What's not in your record is a formal commendation submitted by Lieutenant Colonel Harlan Pruitt 14 months ago, citing your actions during a medical evacuation under direct enemy fire in which you sustained injuries and continued treating casualties for 6 hours before accepting treatment yourself." Marsh looked at her steadily. "The commendation was received by the review board. It was logged, and then it was administratively redirected into a supplemental file that is not attached to your primary service record, which means for all practical purposes, it doesn't exist unless you know where to look." Delia held the Brigadier General's gaze. The room was quiet enough that she could hear the ventilation system above the ceiling tiles. "Why?" she said. "That's what we're investigating. What I can tell you is that the redirection happened at the same level as the officer who signed off on your voluntary separation coding." Marsh paused. "That officer is Colonel Douglas Wren, you know the name." She knew the name. Wren had been the installation commander during her last deployment. He had also been the officer who sat across from her in the debrief after Kandahar, the one who had asked the questions she had answered honestly, and whose expression during those answers had never changed, and who had told her at the end of the session that she had handled a difficult situation with appropriate judgment. She had believed him because she was not yet tired enough to distrust everyone who said something reasonable to her face. "He buried the commendation," she said. "It wasn't a question. The investigation into why is ongoing. What I can tell you is that the commendation exists, the metadata on the filing confirms the redirection, and the IG office has opened a separate inquiry into Colonel Wren's file management conduct over the past 3 years. Marsh's voice did not change in temperature. "You were not told this was happening. That decision was mine, because I needed to establish the full scope before I approached anyone connected to the original case. And now you're approaching me. Because the Harlow Ridge situation put your name back in federal channels, and when it did, the algorithm that cross-references open IG cases flagged the connection." Marsh glanced at the man by the window briefly. Something passed between them that Delia didn't have enough context to read, and then back at Delia. "I need to know what happened in Kandahar, not what you said in the debrief. What actually happened." The ventilation system hummed. Delia looked at the table surface. The grain of the wood ran in one direction and then another, the pattern of something that had grown without planning. "A 9-year-old boy," she said. "He came into the treatment perimeter during an active contact situation. He was injured. I assessed him." She stopped. "Go on," Marsh said. "The guidance in that situation was to hold the perimeter and defer non-combatant treatment until the contact was resolved. I deviated from that guidance." She said it plainly, without inflection or defense. "I treated him. It took 11 minutes. During those 11 minutes, I was not performing the function I was assigned to perform." "And during those 11 minutes," Marsh said, "what happened?" "2 of our personnel took fire from a position I would have been monitoring if I had been at my assigned post." "And?" "And they managed it," Delia said. "Both survived. The boy survived. Nobody died." "Nobody died," Marsh said. But Wren concluded that I had prioritized a non-combatant over operational security and that the outcome didn't change the nature of the deviation. Delia's jaw tightened, barely, the first crack in the evenness she had been holding. I didn't disagree with him. I made a judgment call, and judgment calls have accountability. I accepted the coding. Did he tell you Pruitt had submitted a commendation? No. Did he tell you that both surviving personnel had submitted statements supporting your assessment that the tactical situation was manageable and that your deviation did not materially increase their risk? Delia went still. No, she said. He did not tell me that. Marsh let that sit for a moment. Major Hayes, she said, you accepted a voluntary separation and a neutral coding based on an incomplete presentation of the record. The commendation and the supporting statements were in your file. You were not informed of them before you signed the separation papers. She paused. That is not a minor administrative oversight. The room held. Delia had spent 4 years, the 8 months before she came to Callaway, and the 3.5 years before that, carrying the Kandahar incident as the thing she had done wrong, the thing she couldn't undo, the calculation she had made under fire that she stood behind and was willing to be accountable for, but that had also taken something from her that she hadn't fully named. She had not been looking for exoneration, because she wasn't sure exoneration was the accurate word for what she needed. She had been looking for the version of herself that could live with the complexity of it without it being the whole story. The whole story, it turned out, had been filed in a supplemental folder by a colonel who had never mentioned its existence. She didn't say anything for a moment. The man by the window was very still. What do you need from me? She said finally. A formal statement on the Kandahar incident for the Wren inquiry, Marsh said, and your availability for a records correction process that will take approximately 3 weeks once initiated. She folded her hands on the table. There's also something else, but that can wait until the immediate Harlow Ridge situation resolves. What is it? Marsh looked at her without blinking. It can wait, she said, with a finality that was not dismissal, but was clearly a boundary. One thing at a time. The Finch interview happened the following morning at the Federal Building in Raleigh, as Reyes had said it would, and the account of it arrived in pieces over the next 36 hours through channels that Delia had not established and did not control. Betta Jarvis heard from a hospital administrator who heard it from someone in medical records. Baxter heard it from Reyes directly and texted Delia a summary at 11:40 the night after the interview. Dr. Norwood mentioned something oblique and pointed during a hallway conversation on the second day. The picture that assembled from these pieces was this. Finch had arrived at the interview with personal counsel and had initially declined to address the document forensics directly, a strategy that lasted approximately 40 minutes before Reyes presented the metadata analysis alongside a timeline cross-referenced with Finch's badge access records and the security footage from the nursing station on the night the edits were made. He had then, according to Baxter's summary, revised his account significantly. What he told Reyes was that Karen Dolby had asked him, twice, and then a third time, to review and clarify incident reports that contained nursing observations she considered outside the scope of the nursing role. He characterized it as a routine administrative process. Reyes, according to the same summary, characterized it as evidence tampering and had asked him whether he understood the distinction. His personal counsel had then intervened, but not before Finch had said enough on the record to establish that he knew what he was altering and why. Delia read Baxter's text in her apartment and then set her phone face down on the kitchen counter and made coffee and drank it standing at the window, looking at the street 6 blocks from the hospital. A dog was walking its owner along the far sidewalk, a large, cheerful animal with no opinion about any of this, which seemed correct. She had expected to feel something sharper when the confirmation came. What she felt instead was a kind of bone-level tiredness that was not defeat. It was the tiredness of having been right about something for a long time, and finally being in a room where right was acknowledged as right, which was not the same as easy. It never was. She was back on trauma intake the next morning. Not by her own request, the CMO had quietly reversed Karen's reassignment, and the charge nurse had told Delia at the start of shift, with the careful phrasing of someone delivering news they expected to be received as good. Delia said thank you, tied her hair back, and went to work. The ER had not changed. The volume, the pace, the particular controlled chaos of emergency medicine at a regional facility, None of it had changed. What had changed was the room's temperature around her. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have been visible to someone who hadn't been living inside the building's social architecture for 39 days. But the nurses who had been professionally careful now made eye contact and sometimes asked her opinion. The resident she had corrected, Webb, a third-year named Torres, stopped having somewhere else to be when she walked into a bay. The charge nurse on afternoon shift, who had not previously initiated any conversation that wasn't operationally required, brought her coffee at 2:30 and set it on the counter without comment, which was a gesture Delia understood in the language that competent, busy people used when they wanted to say something they weren't going to say out loud. Karen Dolby's office light was dark for 2 of the 3 days following Finch's interview. On the 3rd day, she was present but audibly not herself, visible in the corridors, conducting standard supervisory functions, but with the subdued quality of someone who had entered a portion of their professional life that was going to require careful navigation and knew it. She did not approach Delia. She did not generate paperwork. Reyes called at 4:15 on a Thursday. Finch submitted a voluntary statement this morning, she said. It's on the record. He's named Dolby in connection with 3 specific incidents of requested document revision over a period of 8 months. Delia was in the medication room, the door closed for the privacy of the call. 3 incidents. 2 prior to your arrival, 1 current. One of the prior incidents involves a nursing staff member who filed a wrongful termination complaint 16 months ago that was dismissed because the clinical documentation didn't support her account. Reyes paused. It didn't support her account because the documentation had been altered before the complaint review. The medication room smelled like antiseptic and the particular sterile nothing of sealed packaging. Delia leaned against the counter and thought about Melinda Park, who had caught a missed aortic dissection and been written up for it and left 6 weeks later. Whether Park was the wrongful termination complaint or someone else, she didn't know, and it didn't change the weight of it. What happens to her case? She said. If the documentation revision is confirmed as evidence in the inquiry, it substantially changes the evidentiary basis of the original complaint review. Her attorney has already been contacted by our office. Reyes's voice had its usual absence of editorial. I want you to know. Your documentation was the thread. It wasn't the only thread, but it was the one that was current and specific enough to give us a starting point for the document forensics. Delia absorbed this. Is Karen being formally charged? She said. The inquiry is still open. I can't speak to charges. What I can tell you is that the hospital's board of directors has convened an emergency governance session for Monday morning, and the CMO has requested independent legal counsel separate from the hospital's institutional counsel. A pause. When institutions get separate counsel from their own lawyers, it's because they've determined that institutional interests require them to cooperate with the investigation rather than resist it. They're going to give you what you need. They're going to give us what we ask for, Reyes said, which was more precise. After she hung up, Delia stood in the medication room for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she pulled the door open and went back to the floor. The board meeting happened Monday. Delia was not in the room. She was working a full shift because the hospital was still a hospital and the governance crisis did not pause the emergency volume. But she felt its effects in the way institutional decisions always move through a building, before they were announced, through the behavior of people who knew, and after they were announced, through the behavior of everyone else. By noon, the nursing staff on the trauma floor had heard something. By 2 o'clock, the something had a shape. Finch had been suspended pending the completion of the IG inquiry, effective immediately, with temporary coverage for his caseload being arranged through the hospital's physician staffing pool. The suspension was administrative rather than disciplinary for the moment, the legal language of an institution that was moving carefully. But the practical effect was that his badge would not open the department doors starting tonight. Delia heard it from Bet Jarvis at 2:15 in the break room over the coffee maker that had finally been fixed. Finch is out, Bet said without preamble. Heard it from the administrator's assistant 20 minutes ago. Temporary suspension, Delia said. For now. Bet poured her coffee. Karen's meeting with HR at 4. I don't know what that looks like yet. I don't either, Delia said. They stood at the counter drinking coffee, 2 women who had been doing hard work in the same building for different lengths of time, and didn't say anything else about it because there wasn't anything else to say that the facts hadn't already said more clearly. At 3:50, Dr. Marcus Webb found her in Bay 3, where she was managing a patient with a suspected dislocated shoulder and a very strong opinion about how much it hurt. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Webb said from the doorway. "In a minute," she said. She finished the assessment, updated the chart, handed off to the on-call orthopedics resident, and stepped into the corridor. Webb looked like he hadn't been sleeping especially well. He was in the second year of residency, which meant he probably hadn't been sleeping well since medical school, but this was a different kind of tired. "I gave a statement," he said, "to the investigator, last week." Delia looked at him. "The IV case and the compartment syndrome patient during the mass casualty activation. I documented what I observed and what I would have done differently without your input." He looked at the floor for a moment and then back at her. "I also told her that I had been informally advised by Dr. Finch during my first week on rotation that nursing escalations should generally be treated as well-intentioned but non-clinical and filtered through attending judgment before being acted on." "He told you that directly?" Delia said. "In those words? No. But the meaning was clear." Webb exhaled. "I didn't think about it at the time. I just absorbed it as how things worked here. I've been thinking about that a lot recently." She looked at him for a moment. He was 27 or 28 and still deciding who he was going to be as a physician, and something in the last 2 weeks had shifted something in that decision. "Thank you for the statement," she said. He nodded, didn't leave immediately. "Is it always like this? Places like this?" "Sometimes," she said. "Not always. It depends on whether anyone is willing to make it different." He seemed to sit with that. Then he nodded again and walked away. At 4:30, Karen Dolby left the HR meeting. Delia saw her cross the lobby, coat on, bag on her shoulder, moving with the particular compressed energy of someone who had been told something in a room they couldn't argue with and had not yet found a place to put it. She did not look toward the nursing station. She pushed through the exterior door, and the automatic glass closed behind her, and she was gone. The charge nurse appeared at Delia's elbow 20 minutes later. "Karen's on administrative leave," she said. "Effective close of business today. We've got interim coverage from the CMO's office." "Okay," Delia said. "Rhea's also called the main line. She's got a statement ready for your review." The charge nurse paused. "I don't know what all of this is exactly, but I want you to know. Most of us in this department knew something was wrong. We just didn't know how to say it." "Now there's a record," Delia said. "That's what matters." The charge nurse looked at her for a moment, then she went back to her station. At 6 o'clock, Delia received a call from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. She answered it. "Major Hayes." The voice was male, precise, with the specific cadence of someone accustomed to speaking in briefings. "This is Colonel Douglas Wren." The corridor outside Bay 4 was empty. A monitor beeped inside. The overhead lights did what they always did. Delia did not say anything. "I want you to know," Wren said, "that the decision to redirect your commendation was made in what I believed at the time to be the best interest of—" "Colonel Wren," Delia said. He stopped. "You need to stop talking," she said. "Right now. Whatever you're about to tell me about your reasoning, you should be telling it to the IG investigator, not to me, and you should be doing it with your legal counsel present." She paused. "If you've called me without legal counsel, you've made a serious error." A silence. Long enough that she could hear the quality of the air on his end of the line. An indoor space, quiet, the ambient suggestion of a place he was alone in. "I understand," he said finally. "Good," she said. "Don't call this number again." She ended the call. She stood in the corridor outside Bay 4 for 10 seconds, holding her phone, and let the full weight of that conversation move through her and out the other side. Wren had called her. Not Reyes. Not his attorney. Her. Which meant he was rattled enough to make a call that his attorney would have told him specifically not to make, and rattled people made exactly these kinds of mistakes when the walls were close enough that they could feel them. She filed it. She would tell Reyes in the morning. She put her phone away and finished her shift. At 7:50, Baxter was waiting in the parking lot. This was apparently a thing he did now. Appear in the vicinity of the hospital at shift change with something to say that he had decided required a parking lot instead of a phone call. "Wren called you," he said. Not a question. "How do you know?" "Because he's been making calls he shouldn't make for the last 48 hours, and people are tracking them." He looked at her. You handled it? I told him to talk to his lawyer. Baxter let out a breath that was mostly tired. The Wren investigation is moving faster than the Harlow Ridge inquiry. The supplemental file he maintained wasn't just your commendation. There are 6 other personnel records in there, 5 junior officers and 1 enlisted medical specialist, all of them separated from service in the last 4 years, all of them with what their official records describe as voluntary or stress-related departures. Delia stood in the parking lot and let that land. 6 other people, 5 officers and a specialist, moving through civilian life with incomplete records, carrying whatever version of the Kandahar accounting they had been given, which was, she now understood, only the accounting that Wren had decided they deserved. Are they being contacted? She said. The IG office has located 4 of the 6. The other 2 are in process. He looked at the hospital building. Marsh wants you in Raleigh on Wednesday. She says she has something to show you. What is it? She didn't tell me. He paused. She also said to tell you it's not bad news. Delia looked at the hospital building. Through the lobby glass, she could see the nursing station and the corridor beyond it, and the ordinary movement of a facility doing its work at the end of a day. 3 days ago, that lobby had been the last thing she thought about before she fell asleep, because the lobby was the place she walked into every morning and put on the role that this institution had assigned her and did work that the institution had told her was within her scope and no further. The lobby looked the same. Everything on the other side of it was different. I'll be there Wednesday, she said. Baxter nodded. He started toward his car and then stopped. One more thing, the Okafor case, the incident report. The original version, the one before Finch edited it. He paused with his back to her, a thing people did when they were about to say something they needed the slight distance for. It attributed the decompression procedure, the needle placement, the whole clinical call. It attributed all of it to you, by name, accurately. He turned around. That's the version that's going into the permanent record now. She didn't have a response ready for that. She hadn't expected to need one. Get some sleep, he said, and walked to his car. She stood in the lot until his taillights cleared the exit. The night was cool and smelled like rain that hadn't started yet. The particular pre-rain smell of a Carolina evening that she had been breathing for 39 days without noticing it was specific to this place, this season, this version of her life that she had tried to make small and quiet and that had refused, apparently, to cooperate. She was halfway to her car when her phone buzzed. A text from Reyes. Interview transcripts from the board session came through. You need to see Finch's full statement before Wednesday. Sending now. She stood in the parking lot and read it. The transcript was long, 47 pages, and she didn't have time to read all of it tonight, but she read the section Reyes had highlighted, which was on page 31. The question Reyes had asked Finch, when you were asked to revise the Okafor incident report, did you believe the revision was clinically accurate? Finch's answer, verbatim, on the record, under formal federal interview conditions. No. I knew the original report was accurate. The nurse, Hayes, she performed the procedure. She made the call that saved him. I knew that when I changed it. The question that followed. Then why did you make the change? A pause in the transcript marked with a timestamp that showed 11 seconds of silence. Then, because I was asked to. And because I didn't think anyone was going to check. Delia read those 2 sentences 3 times. The rain that had been threatening finally started. Not dramatic, just the quiet beginning of something that had been building all evening, the kind of rain that arrived without announcement and settled in like it intended to stay. She put her phone in her pocket, got in her car, and drove home. She didn't know yet what Marsh wanted to show her in Raleigh on Wednesday. She didn't know what the full shape of the Wren inquiry was going to reveal, or how many people it was going to reach, or what it was going to require from her before it was done. She didn't know who had been the first to call the IG office, whether it was Melinda Park or someone else she had never met, some other person who had stood in some other corridor in this building and decided that the pattern was too clear to keep absorbing. What she knew was this: Finch's statement was now on a federal record. Karen Dolby's administrative leave was documented and dated. Wren had made a phone call his lawyer would have told him not to make, and the people tracking his calls had noted it. Roy Tanner was in the cardiac ICU recovering from a myocardial infarction that had been caught in time. Lily, the 5-year-old with the bluish lips, had been discharged from pediatrics 8 days ago, according to the chart she had quietly checked. And Sergeant First Class Darnell Okafor, somewhere at the military facility at Bragg, had a permanent medical record that now bore the name of the person who had actually saved his life. She sat in her car in front of her apartment and listened to the rain for a while. Then she went inside. Her phone buzzed at 11:47. Not Reyes this time, not Baxter. A number she didn't recognize with a North Carolina area code. She answered it. A woman's voice. Careful, measured, with the quality of someone who had rehearsed the first sentence and wasn't sure about the rest. Is this Delia Hayes? It is, she said. My name is Melinda Park, the woman said. I used to work at Harlow Ridge. Delia sat down on the edge of her bed. I know, she said. I was hoping you'd call. I was told, Melinda said carefully, that my case might be reopened, based on new evidence. That's right. A pause. The sound of someone on the other end of a line deciding how much to trust a voice they had never heard before, running the calculation between the hope of being right and the cost of being wrong again. Can you tell me, Melinda said. What happened? What changed? Delia looked at the wall across from her bed. The bare wall of an apartment she had chosen specifically because it had no history, because it was no place she had ever been before. The wall of a life she had tried to make small and contained and deliberately unimportant. Everything changed, she said, and I think it's going to keep changing. She paused. I can explain all of it, but first, are you okay? Another pause. I'm better than I was, Melinda said. Good, Delia said. That's a start? And she meant it in a way that went past professional, past procedural, past everything that had happened in the last 39 days, and arrived somewhere more fundamental than any of it. Outside, the rain kept going. The kind that settles in like it intends to stay, that changes the smell and sound of everything it touches, that makes the morning after feel like a different world than the evening before. They talked for an hour and 20 minutes. Melinda Park's voice started careful and got steadier as it went. The way voices did when the person behind them realized they weren't going to be interrupted or redirected or quietly managed toward a version of events that served someone else's interests. She had been a trauma nurse for 9 years before Harlow Ridge. She had taken the position there because it was close to where her mother was living, and her mother had needed help, and she had spent 14 months at the facility before the aortic dissection case that ended her employment. She had filed the wrongful termination complaint with the clarity of someone who knew the truth and expected it to matter, and she had watched it dismissed with the slow, particular devastation of someone who had built their professional identity around the belief that accuracy was protection. It was not protection, not in a system that controlled the documentation of what accurate meant. She had moved on in the way people moved on from things that hadn't actually resolved, by putting distance between herself and the active wound while the wound kept doing its work underneath. She was working at a smaller regional hospital 40 miles south. She was good at her job. She had not stopped being good at her job, which was the part that institutional failure never reached, though it tried. Delia listened. She did not perform empathy or engineer the conversation toward any particular destination. She just listened, and when Melinda was finished, she said, "The documentation that was altered, Finch's statement puts it on the record. Reyes's office has the original. Your attorney is going to have what they need." My attorney, Melinda said. She's been on contingency for 16 months. She never dropped the case. That's a good attorney, Delia said. She believed me, Melinda said. It was a simple statement, but the weight behind it was the weight of someone who had spent 16 months being not believed by the structures that were supposed to evaluate things fairly. After Melinda hung up, Delia sat on the edge of her bed for a while without moving. The rain was still going. She was tired in a way that went past the shift and past the accumulated days and into something older. The tiredness of a person who had been carrying a version of themselves that was smaller than the true version for long enough that the carrying had become its own kind of habit. She didn't solve this tonight. She wasn't going to. She set her alarm for 6 and went to sleep. Wednesday came with low cloud cover and the kind of damp cold that a Carolina November produced when it was feeling specific about it. And Delia drove to Raleigh with her documentation on a secured drive in her jacket pocket and arrived at the federal building at 9:40 for a 10 o'clock meeting that Marsh had scheduled through Baxter with the precision of someone who did not leave logistical details to chance. The building was the standard institutional architecture of federal offices, efficient, deliberately unimpressive, designed to communicate competence rather than authority. Baxter met her in the lobby. He had a coffee and handed it to her without comment, which she accepted. "How are you?" he said. "Ask me after," she said. He nodded. They went up. Marsh was in a conference room with Reyes and two people Delia hadn't met, a civilian attorney from the IG office named Teller and a lieutenant colonel from the Army Surgeon General's staff, whose name was Bright, and whose job in the room was apparently to manage documentation, because she had a laptop open and a printer connected and the focused manner of someone whose function was to make things official. They sat down. Marsh did not open with pleasantries. "Wren submitted a formal statement to the inquiry yesterday afternoon," she said, "with counsel present and on the record." She slid a printed summary across the table. "He has confirmed the deliberate redirection of your commendation and has identified the rationale as, and I'm quoting, a management decision to minimize the institutional visibility of the Kandahar incident in the interest of operational continuity." Delia looked at the summary. "He's protecting someone else." "That's the assessment of the inquiry team," Marsh said. "The investigation is ongoing and I can't give you names. What I can tell you is that the scope of the Wren inquiry has expanded beyond personnel file management." A pause. "That is not your problem to solve. What is your business is this." She nodded to Bright, who fed a document into the printer. The document that came out was 2 pages. Bright walked it to Delia and set it on the table. It was a formal service record correction, signed by an authority 2 levels above the office that had originally coded her separation. It documented the commendation submitted by Lieutenant Colonel Pruitt, the full text of it, which she had never read, which described her actions during the Kandahar evacuation in the precise language of someone who had been in the field and understood exactly what those 11 minutes had cost her and exactly what they had produced. It documented the supporting statements from the 2 surviving personnel. It corrected her separation coding from voluntary stress-related to honorable discharge with commendation, effective retroactively to the original date. She read it twice. The commendation language described a medic who had assessed a deteriorating non-combatant in an active contact environment, treated him within a tactically sound window, maintained situational awareness of her assigned personnel throughout, and contributed directly to the survival of both the child and the 2 team members who subsequently managed the contact without her. Pruitt had written it in the flat, technical vocabulary of military commendation, but underneath the vocabulary was the shape of what had actually happened. A woman making a judgment call under fire that a subsequent review, conducted honestly, confirmed was the right one. Wren had known. He had read Pruitt's report, read the supporting statements, and then filed all of it in a folder that was designed to be unfindable. She looked up from the document. "The original commendation text," she said. "Pruitt wrote it." "Yes," Marsh said. "Is he—" "He was informed this morning that the commendation is being confirmed and entered into your official record." Marsh's expression had something in it that was harder to categorize than her usual precision. "He's been retired for 2 years," he said. She paused in the way that people paused when they were deciding whether to relay something personal or keep the meeting clinical. "He said he's relieved. His word." Delia set the document down, picked up her coffee. It had gone slightly cold, but she drank it anyway, because she needed to do something with her hands, and this was what was available. "You said there was something else," she said. "In the hospital, last week." Marsh folded her hands. "Harlow Ridge's board of directors met again yesterday. In that meeting, the CMO presented a proposal, developed jointly with their new institutional counsel and the interim medical staff leadership, to create a new position within the hospital structure." She held Delia's gaze. "Director of Clinical Safety and Trauma Standards. It's a newly created role. It would carry attending-level authority over clinical protocol development, nursing escalation procedures, and incident review for the trauma and emergency departments." Another pause. "They've asked whether you would consider it." The room was quiet. Baxter, to her left, was looking at the table. Reyes was looking at her legal pad. Bright had her hand still on the laptop. Teller had the expression of someone observing a moment they understood the significance of. "That's a significant position," Delia said. "Yes," Marsh said, "for a nurse." For a major with a confirmed commendation, 14 years of trauma experience, and a documented record of identifying systemic clinical failures, in a facility that subsequently required federal investigation. Marsh's voice was even. The title they've attached to the position doesn't fully reflect the authority it would carry. That was intentional. Delia looked at the correction document still in front of her, at her name in official typeface with the corrected coding beside it, at the commendation text that had existed for 14 months, in a folder that was supposed to be unreadable. "I need to think about it," she said. "Of course," Marsh said. "There's no deadline on the offer. The inquiry timeline is separate." "How long until the Harlow Ridge inquiry concludes?" Reyes looked up from her legal pad. "Formal findings in 4 to 6 weeks. The document forensics are complete. The interview record is complete. We're in the analysis phase." She paused. "The findings will be public. The institutional report will be available to the board, the staff, the press, if they request it. The names of the individuals whose conduct is cited will be in the report." Public. The word sat in the room with its specific weight. "Finch," Delia said. "In the report." "Dolby." "In the report." Delia nodded once. She picked up the correction document, folded it carefully along its original crease, and put it in her jacket pocket beside the secure drive. She stood up. "Thank you," she said. To Marsh, to Reyes, to the room. "I mean that without qualification." Marsh stood as well. For a moment, she simply looked at Delia with the expression that Delia had been trying to categorize since the first night in the East Corridor, and she finally had a word for it. Recognition. Not the institutional kind, not the formal acknowledgement of a record being corrected or a title being offered. The human kind. The look of one person seeing another person clearly for what they actually are, without the layers of institutional interpretation that systems put over people when they need them to be smaller or more manageable than they are. "Major Hayes," Marsh said, "for what it's worth, I've reviewed a great many service records in this role. The ones that stay with me are the ones where the person's actual conduct and their official record are the furthest apart." She paused. "Yours was the furthest apart I've seen." Delia held the Brigadier General's gaze. "I'll be in touch about the position," she said. She and Baxter took the elevator down. In the lobby, he held the door and she walked out into the cold, damp morning and stopped on the federal building's front steps and breathed the outside air for a moment. "Well," Baxter said beside her. "What?" she said. They stood there in the cold for a few seconds like two people who had arrived somewhere that neither of them had precisely planned to arrive and were working out what to do with the fact that they were here. "The position," he said. "Are you going to take it?" She looked at the street, a city doing its morning work, indifferent to the things that had just happened in a conference room on the 4th floor of the building behind her. "Probably," she said. He nodded. Something in his face settled. "Good," he said, and left it there, which was the right call. The formal findings of the IG inquiry were released on a Thursday morning, 5 weeks after Reyes had walked into Harlow Ridge with a briefcase and a federal ID, and the specific walk of someone who had not come to be polite. Delia was at work when they dropped. She was in Bay 2 with a patient, a 40-year-old woman who had come in with what she called a bad migraine and what the CT would confirm was a small subarachnoid bleed requiring immediate neurosurgical consultation. And she finished what she was doing and handed off correctly and completely before she looked at her phone. The report was 43 pages. She read the executive summary in the medication room during a 10-minute break. The language of federal inquiry reports was specific and deliberate and stripped of anything that looked like emotion, which made the facts they contained land with a particular flat force. The report cited Harlow Ridge Medical Center for systemic failure to maintain accurate clinical incident documentation. It cited patterns of deliberate revision to official records by medical staff with the intent to misattribute clinical interventions and suppress nursing observations that contradicted attending physician assessments. It cited 2 years of adverse outcomes attributable at least in part to the culture of clinical deference that this documentation pattern enforced. It named Dr. Garrett Finch by name. It named Karen Dolby by name. It described specific incidents with dates and patient identifiers and the documented gap between what the official record said and what the security footage, monitor data, and original documentation showed. It also, on page 31, named Nurse Delia Hayes in a section that described her role in identifying and documenting the pattern that had made the inquiry possible. The language was federal in its restraint, but the sequence it described was accurate and complete, and it was on a public record now, which meant it could not be redirected into a supplemental folder or managed into something smaller than what it was. She put her phone away and went back to work. The consequences arrived at different speeds, the way consequences always did. Finch's medical staff privileges at Harlow Ridge were suspended by the board within 48 hours of the report's release, pending the outcome of a formal medical board review that, based on the documented record, was not expected to conclude in his favor. His personal legal counsel filed a response that the inquiry team was required to review, which bought some time but did not change the underlying forensics. The metadata didn't negotiate. Karen Dolby's administrative leave became a formal termination 4 days after the report. The letter from the hospital, which Bet Jarvis heard about through the lateral network and relayed to Delia in the break room with the directness of someone reporting a weather event, cited the findings of the federal inquiry and the hospital's obligation to maintain clinical integrity standards. Karen did not contest it publicly. She did not return to the building. Melinda Park's attorney filed a motion to reopen the wrongful termination case the day after the report. The motion was supported by the inquiry findings and by Finch's recorded statement on the record revision. The hospital's counsel, operating now under the imperative of institutional cooperation rather than institutional defense, did not oppose the motion. The case was reopened within a week. Melinda called Delia that evening with a voice that was composed and careful, and underneath the composition, there was something she hadn't heard from Melinda before, the tentative, almost disbelieving sound of someone who had been told, by official mechanisms that had once failed her, that they had been wrong. "It's not over yet," Melinda said. "No," Delia said, "but it's different now." "It's different," Melinda said. "Yes." The 6 other personnel whose records Wren had managed into supplemental files were identified and contacted through the IG process. 4 of them agreed to participate in the records correction process. 2 declined, which was their right, and which Delia understood without judgment. Not everyone wanted the institution to revisit what the institution had done to them. Some people had rebuilt their lives around a closed door, and reopening it cost something even when the purpose was correction. Wren's inquiry moved more slowly, as military inquiries did. But it moved. The expanded scope that Marsh had mentioned in Raleigh continued expanding as the document forensics opened into personnel decisions that reached further than anyone outside the inquiry had expected. He was removed from his command position pending the investigation's completion and reassigned to a non-supervisory administrative role, which in the specific language of military consequence meant that his career, as a career, was finished. Delia noted all of this in the way she noted things, accurately, without either satisfaction or indifference, in the part of her mind that kept the record straight. Justice, she had come to understand, rarely looked like the thing you pictured when you were in the middle of fighting for it. It looked like paperwork. It looked like corrected metadata. It looked like an attorney's motion being not opposed, or a personnel file being transferred from a supplemental folder back into the primary record where it had always belonged. It didn't look like resolution exactly. It looked like accuracy. And accuracy, she had decided, was close enough. She took the position. She told Marsh by phone on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the Raleigh meeting, with the particular absence of ceremony that decisions felt right, deserving when they were the correct ones. Marsh said good, in the same way that Baxter had said it, and Delia recognized this as the way capable people express things that mattered to them when they had decided that expressing them simply was better than expressing them elaborately. The official announcement went to hospital staff via the CMO's office on a Friday morning. Director of Clinical Safety and Trauma Standards. The language of the announcement described the position's scope, protocol development, escalation authority, incident review, and named her qualifications, which now included her corrected service record and her confirmed commendation, which had been cleared for disclosure in her professional profile at her request. She was in Bay 3 when the announcement went out. A post-surgical patient with drainage concerns that she assessed and escalated to the attending on call within 4 minutes of identification. Standard work. The kind that didn't generate commendations or federal inquiries or Thursday morning report releases. The kind that was the actual substance of medicine, the daily, unglamorous, essential work of paying close enough attention to keep people from falling through the gaps that systems created when they stopped being careful. She finished the assessment, updated the chart, and was washing her hands at the bay sink when Priya appeared in the doorway. "The announcement came out," Priya said. "I know." Priya stood there for a moment, working through something. She was a year into nursing, still assembling the professional version of herself, still learning which parts of her instincts to trust and which ones to interrogate. She had been the nurse at the triage desk on the morning Delia had walked past and seen Lily's lips and changed the course of the morning. She had said, afterward, "Now you know what to look for," and meant it. "The pediatric case," Priya said. "First week you were here. I've been thinking about it." "Okay," Delia said. "I should have caught it at triage, the retraction. I was looking at the father and not at her." She wasn't making an excuse of it. She was naming it. "You caught it in your mind when I pointed it out," Delia said. "That's how it starts. You have to see it wrong once before you know what right looks like." She turned off the water. "Your job going forward is to make sure you only see it wrong once." Priya nodded. "Is that what happened to you? Somewhere?" Delia looked at her. "Many times," she said. "The learning never actually stops. It just gets less expensive as you get better at it." Priya absorbed this. Then she said, "Congratulations. On the position." "Thank you," Delia said. "Now go check on the patient in Bay 5. His pressure's been variable, and I want eyes on him every 30 minutes. Priya went. Okafor came back on a Wednesday in December, 41 days after his transfer to the military facility at Bragg. He walked in through the main entrance on his own, which was the first thing. No wheelchair, no escort, moving with the specific, careful physicality of someone whose body had been through something significant and was still in the process of deciding how much of its previous capability it was going to restore. He was in civilian clothes. He had the tattoo on his left forearm that she hadn't read closely enough to understand in the trauma bay, and she still didn't read it closely enough now because it wasn't her business. He found her at the nursing station, which suggested someone had told him where she would be. She had a reasonable suspicion about who. "Sergeant Okafor," she said. "Ma'am," he said. Then he corrected himself. "Major." "Delia's fine," she said. "How are you?" "Breathing," he said, which is different from before. She looked at him. He looked like a man who had been through something and come out the other side of it, carrying a clear understanding of exactly how close the margins had been. People who had been that close to the margins usually looked one of two ways afterward, shaken or sharpened. Okafor looked sharpened. "You came a long way for a follow-up," she said. "I wanted to see what the place looked like." He glanced around the nursing station, the corridors, the bay windows, taking inventory. "Looks different than I remembered." "It is different," she said. He looked at her for a moment. He had the quality of someone who spoke carefully because he had learned that careless speaking had costs. "The new position," he said. "Baxter told me." "Of course he did. He also told me what it took to get there." "It took a lot of people," she said, "not just me." "Sure," Okafor said, in the tone of a man who understood the technical truth of that statement and also understood that it was incomplete. He looked at the nursing station counter, at the organized surface of a department that had spent 6 weeks under new standards with a new protocol framework and was beginning to look like a place that took its own organization seriously. "You know what you did," he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was something quieter than that. An acknowledgement from one person who understood high-stakes environments to another, across the specific shared language of having been in situations where the cost of getting it wrong was not abstract. "Yes," she said. "Then I don't have to tell you." He looked at her directly. "I'm still going to say it." "All right." "You saved my life," he said. "The technical version is that you identified a tension pneumo under pressure with no imaging and corrected it manually in a trauma bay with a physician calling for the wrong treatment in front of his team, and you were right, and he was wrong, and you did not hesitate." He said all of this with the flat precision of someone reciting a record. "The version that matters is that I have a 9-year-old daughter, and I was going to go home to her, and I did, because of what you did in that room." Delia held his gaze. She didn't have a clean response to that. She had learned, a long time ago, that clean responses to things that mattered were usually the wrong ones. That the right response was often the one that acknowledged the weight, without either deflecting it or performing gratitude for having been given it. "I'm glad you went home," she said. He nodded once. They stood at the nursing station in a hospital on a Wednesday morning in December, with the ordinary volume of emergency medicine happening around them. And the moment was not dramatic or cinematic or anything, except what it actually was. Two people who had been in the same room during 11 minutes that counted, on opposite sides of the stretcher, standing in the aftermath of it. "I have one more thing," he said. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. "From Pruitt. He got my contact through Baxter and asked me to deliver it. He said the mail felt wrong for it." She took the paper, unfolded it. It was handwritten, in the angular, efficient script of someone who had written a great many field notes and had never fully unlearned the style. 4 sentences. "Major Hayes, I wrote the commendation because it was accurate, and accuracy is the minimum I owe the people who served under my command. I'm sorry it took this long to reach you. I want you to know that I knew, on the day it happened, exactly what you were doing and why. I was proud to have served with you. No signature, just the handwriting." She refolded it along its crease. "Thank you," she said to Okafor. "He wanted you to have it before he heard about it officially," Okafor said. "He said the official version would be accurate, but it wouldn't be personal." He adjusted his jacket. "He's right about that, usually. The official version gets the facts. The personal version gets the truth." He left the way he had come, through the main entrance, moving with the careful physicality of a body still doing its accounting. She watched him go, and then she put the folded paper in her jacket pocket beside the corrected service record that she still carried, for reasons she hadn't fully examined, and she went back to work. The department changed. Not overnight. Nothing real changed overnight, regardless of what the announcement said, or what the inquiry found, or what the board approved in an emergency governance session. Real change happened in the accumulation of smaller changes that individually looked like nothing. A protocol update that required documented nursing escalation responses within 15 minutes, with attending sign-off and timestamp. A new incident review process with cross-discipline representation that meant no single physician could revise a report without a review board seeing the revision. A monthly clinical debrief that included nursing staff at every level, where cases were reviewed not for blame assignment, but for learning extraction. The nursing staff started talking differently in the break room. Not dramatically, not the way people talked when they had been through something and wanted everyone to know it. Quietly, practically, in the way that people talked when the ground under them had become more solid, and they had started trusting it with more of their weight. Webb became one of the people Delia could work with most directly. He had a sharp clinical mind that his earlier training had been pointed in the wrong direction, and redirecting it was a matter of changing its orientation rather than rebuilding it, which was faster and more durable. He stopped performing the hierarchy and started performing the work. There was a difference, and he had found it, and she noted it without making a production of it, because making a production of progress was how you interrupted it. Bet Jarvis, on the last day before her retirement, which she had already scheduled before any of this happened, a date she had chosen 2 years ago and was not going to move for institutional drama, stopped by Delia's new office, which was a small room adjacent to the trauma department with a window that looked toward the parking structure. "I want to say something," Bet said, "before I don't work here anymore." "Go ahead," Delia said. "I've been in this building for 11 years, Bet said. I've seen 4 different CMOs, 3 nursing supervisors, including Dolby, and more physicians than I can count. I've seen people come in who knew exactly what they were doing and get eaten alive by the culture. And I've seen people come in who didn't know what they were doing and get promoted because they knew how to perform competence for the right audience." She stood in the office doorway. "I've never seen someone walk in and just outlast it, the way you did. Most people either leave or they adapt to the culture. You did neither." "I documented everything," Delia said. "That's not what I mean," Bet said. "I mean you stayed yourself, under all of it. That's harder than it sounds." Delia looked at the woman who had sat beside her in the break room and said Melinda Park's name and told her the truth about what this hospital did to the people it couldn't fit into its existing shape. "So did you, she said. "You've been staying yourself in this building for 11 years. Bet's expression did something complicated and then settled. "Well," she said. "Yes, but I had to get to 53 before I stopped minding the cost of it." She looked at Delia. "You figured it out earlier. That's better, I think." She left, and Delia sat in the small office with the parking structure window and thought about what staying yourself actually meant. Not the clean, inspirational version of it, but the daily, imperfect, expensive version. The version where you signed the incident reports you were told to sign and stored your rage in a locked internal folder and documented everything with timestamps and did not allow the people who were diminishing you to see that the diminishment was landing, because the moment they saw it land was the moment they knew they had a lever. The version where you mopped the floor and kept your hands steady and waited, not because you were passive, but because you understood that the time to act was not when you were most angry, but when you had the most evidence. That was the version nobody made a documentary about. It didn't have a clean visual. It just had a woman in plain scrubs at the end of 48 days of documented, time-stamped, unbroken accuracy, still standing. On the 63rd day since she had driven into Callaway with 2 duffel bags and a lease agreement and a deliberate plan to be no one remarkable, Delia Hayes sat in her office and read the final inquiry report in full, all 43 pages. She had read the executive summary the day it dropped, but she had been waiting to read the complete document until she had the time to do it properly, the way she did everything she considered worth doing, completely, without shortcuts, starting at the beginning and going through to the end. The final pages of the inquiry report contained what the IG office called corrective mandates, specific, enforceable requirements that Harlow Ridge would have to document compliance with on a 6-month review schedule for the next 3 years. Protocol revisions, documentation standards, an independent clinical audit of all incident reports from the prior 2 years, cross-referenced against available security footage and monitor data. And on the final page, in the language that federal reports used for recommendations that had not yet been formalized into mandates, a note that the inquiry team found the model being implemented at Harlow Ridge under the new Director of Clinical Safety and Trauma Standards to be a viable framework for consideration at other facilities with identified systemic issues. The model being implemented at Harlow Ridge, her model, assembled from 14 years of knowing what good clinical practice looked like and 4 years of being in places that were willing to give it room, and 39 days of watching what happened when a system actively prevented it, and the particular insight of someone who had learned the cost of silence from both sides, from the silence she had kept that had cost her something, and from the silence others had kept that had cost their patients something, and from the understanding that these 2 costs were related. She closed the report. She thought about the boy in Kandahar. She thought about him often, in the way you thought about the things that had genuinely changed you. Not constantly, not with drama, but the way a room you grew up in came back to you when you smelled something particular. He would be about 13 now. She didn't know his name. She had treated him for 11 minutes under fire and handed him to local medical personnel and gone back to her assignment, and then sat in a debrief room 18 days later and answered every question Wren had asked her with complete accuracy, and had accepted the voluntary coding on her separation because she had understood it to be the honest accounting of what she had done. It had not been the honest accounting. The honest accounting had been written by Pruitt and put in a folder by Wren and found by Marcia's office 14 months later when a nurse at a regional hospital in Callaway, North Carolina, had refused to clean a floor quietly. She wondered sometimes about the relationship between those 2 things, between the 11 minutes in Kandahar and the 42 minutes in Bay 1 with Okafor. She wasn't sure there was a direct line. She wasn't sure the universe operated on the basis of direct lines. But she had spent enough time in situations where the specific thing you knew how to do intersected with the specific moment that thing was needed to understand that preparation and readiness and the refusal to stop being what you actually were had their own logic. Not a neat logic. Not a logic that paid out cleanly or promptly or with the consideration of what it had cost you to maintain it, but a logic. Her phone buzzed. Baxter. A text that said only, "Wren's counsel filed for cooperation agreement today. It's going to be a long process, but it's moving." She typed back, "Good." She put her phone down and looked at the parking structure window. December light, low and specific, doing what winter light did in the south. Coming in at an angle that was almost golden and then not quite, landing on things without committing to them, suggesting warmth without delivering it. Outside in the department, she could hear the ordinary sounds of the trauma floor at mid-afternoon, the rhythmic updates of monitors, the particular rolling sound of a medication cart being moved, a physician on the phone with a specialist, a nurse asking a patient a question, and the patient's careful, considered answer. The sounds of people doing work that mattered in the way that most important work sounded from the outside. Not dramatic, not heroic, just persistent and precise, and aimed at keeping someone alive who would otherwise not be. She had spent 4 years trying to make herself smaller than this. Quieter. Less than what she was, in the hope that smallness would be less expensive, that quiet would be a kind of protection, that choosing a title that didn't match her capability would let her exist without being a target. It hadn't worked. It had never been going to work. Because the thing that made you a target wasn't your rank or your title or the length of your resume. It was the refusal to pretend you didn't see what you saw. It was the hands that stayed steady when everyone else's were shaking. It was the particular quality of presence that said, I have been in worse rooms than this, and I did not break in those rooms, and I will not break in this one. You could not make that small. You could file it away. You could put it in a locker at a hospital 6 blocks from a 1-bedroom apartment in a city you had never been to. And you could wear plain scrubs and clean floors and sign forms for incident reports that were factually incorrect without arguing about them. And you could do all of that and still, in the 42nd minute of a trauma bay with a man whose lung was collapsing, that quality of presence would be exactly what it had always been. They had tried to manage it. They had filed her in a supplemental folder, the institution and the officer both. And they had done so with the confidence of people who believed that what you couldn't see couldn't affect you. They had been wrong about that in the way that powerful people were often wrong about the thing they couldn't see, not through stupidity, but through the particular blindness that came from having always been looked at rather than overlooked. The overlooked knew something the looked at did not. They knew that the absence of recognition was not the same as the absence of capability. They knew that the folder you were filed in was not the document that described you. They knew that the distance between what a system said about you and what you actually were could be the longest distance in the world, or it could be the distance between a mop bucket and a commendation, which was 39 days, which was nothing. Delia Hayes stood up from her desk. She had a protocol review at 3, a debrief with the evening shift charge nurse at 4:30, a call with Reyes at 5 regarding the corrective mandate implementation timeline. And somewhere in the building, patients who needed the things that she and the people around her knew how to give them. Not perfectly, not without error, not without the daily accumulation of moments where someone caught something and someone else missed something and the record was updated accordingly because that was how medicine worked when it worked honestly. She picked up her coffee, cold, she'd forgotten it again, and walked out of her office and into the department. The work was waiting. It was always the work. And the work, she had learned, was not a consolation for the other things. It was not a substitute for recognition or justice or the corrected record or the commendation that finally bore her name in the place it had always belonged. It was the thing that existed before and after and alongside all of those things, the steady ground under everything else, the part of her that no column in a supplemental folder had ever touched. She had never stopped being good at it. That, in the end, was the thing that mattered most. Not because goodness was its own reward in the way that comfortable saying suggested, but because competence, real competence, the kind built from years of paying attention in rooms where the stakes were high enough to demand it, was the only thing that had ever been truly hers. Not granted, not assigned, not filed somewhere by someone else's decision. Hers. And the people who had tried to manage her out of a department she was more qualified to run than any of them had never understood that. They had looked at the plain scrubs and the mop bucket and the compliance with the forms they put in front of her, and they had seen what they expected, someone disposable, someone adaptable, someone who could be moved to a different floor and written up and reduced without consequence. They had been wrong about that. She walked onto the floor. The monitors beeped. Someone needed something. She went to find out what it was.